Is anyone and is everyone in gallery view now or in speakers view? So I think it's quite nice to be in gallery view and see all those little faces. And then yeah, that's I guess another thing that we said yesterday. That I mean that's obviously completely up to you, whatever you prefer. But I think it's nice to be on speakers view when we're having the actual presentations and gallery view during the discussions.
Was it Adorno who was quite amused by the little people on television compared to the cinema screen? And I wonder what he would be making of the tiny people in Zoom.
I was actually in the Jewish Museum in Berlin a couple of weeks ago, which has reopened after I think several years of closure with a brand new exhibition. And everything is the latest state of the art and really wonderful. And we're seeing in the last room is exactly what we're experiencing here. You have a lot of people on their little screens in frames. It's a bit of a Harry Potter-like situation with these animated paintings. And they're being asked several questions. What does it mean to be Jewish? Could you fall in love with a non-Jewish person? Sing us a song, stuff like that, tell us a joke. And it's very nice because you have this conversation going on between these animated portraits, and at some point they sing something together. And so, you know, it becomes part of the exhibition culture, which I think is a wonderful thing. I'm experiencing the same with you. Don't worry, I won't ask you to sing a song or anything. Sorry.
Katja, is it loads of simultaneous conversations?
No, no, one after the other. But okay. So you know, there's a question, one answers, but everyone remains animated, so there's no one freezes or anything. People keep moving. Very nice, very well done. I have to say, I highly recommend it.
Sorry, Marie.
I don't know how people feel. Like I'd be happy to start 2 minutes early. Yeah.
Yes, everyone seems to be there and ready to go. Speakers are there.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
So so this is my time to take over from Marie. I'm going to chair the first of two panels today, which has two speakers. And the title of the panel is Stay Alert, Stay Connected, Technologies of Friendship and Surveillance. We have two media archaeological papers in a way. So the first traces the communication of friendship back to the 18th century letter that might be welcomed with a passionate kiss onto the page. And the second considers the roots of anxiety we might experience whenever our mobile phone gives one of these shocking sounds. So I very much look forward to the session, and I have a feeling that both these papers speak, you know, to each other in various possible ways. And I also look forward to the discussion, drawing out all these potential relations, particularly since there seems to be some kind of connection to one of the things we've been talking about yesterday, starting out with the example of the pneumatic tube, and talking about the certain form of distance that may create between the individual people communicating, but also at the same time a certain proximity, and that several people will have touched that particular letter that is traveling through the underworld of Paris and waking up someone. So there's also that shock element involved in the experience. And that I'm hoping is one of the themes we might be talking about a little more intensely throughout this day, motivated perhaps by some of the thoughts and ideas that come up in these two papers in our first session. Our first speaker is our dear colleague Tobias Heinrich, who is a lecturer in German at the University of Kent. He has published, amongst many things, a book which is called, in the original title, Leben lesen, zur Theorie und Biographie 1800, Reading Lives, on a theory of biography around 1800. It came out in 2016. And he has published widely on German literature from the 18th century to the 21st century, in Austrian film, on topics like migration, terrorism, celebrity politics. So, you know, he's a man of many interests, and his current research project, which, as far as I know, has been keeping him busy for quite some time, is an exploration of the cultural history of friendship. So paper today will be related to that ongoing research project of Tobias, and the title is Technologies of Friendship, Past and Present. I'm delighted that Tobias can be with us today, and I look forward, Tobias, to hearing your paper.
Thank you, Katja, and thanks everybody on the organizing panel for such a fantastic, fascinating conference. So far, making this happen under very special circumstances. Katja, can you give me a thumbs up whether you can hear me all right? Yeah, okay, that's always the weird thing. You hear your own voice, but you don't know whether the others.
It's all fine. At least I can hear you incredibly well. I don't think anyone is experiencing difficulty.
Good. Okay, before I start, I probably, so I uploaded a PowerPoint presentation, just thought that would be a nice way to share my material. And I think I'll share this presentation with you right now. And then what I'll do in my 8 minutes is simply to comment a little bit on these slides. Okay, you can all see the slides now. Yes, good. Okay. Yeah, as Katja said, this is talking a little bit about a project that has indeed been keeping me busy for a while. About the cultural history of friendship in the age of mass media. Traces the relationship between friendship and the ways in which it is facilitated, so in which friendship is facilitated through media and technology in modern times. And ultimately, I'm trying to demonstrate how the narrative logic of mass media, but also the very makeup of the technological devices that we use to communicate, have been modeled after the intimate exchange between friends. For a variety of reasons, I start in the 18th century. It's Johann Wolfgang Goethe who prefaces Die Leiden des jungen Werthers, a novel that played no small role in the emergence of European Romanticism, with the words, "Let this book be thy friend." Now, what I'm asking is, what kind of world is it in which an author promotes his book as a stand-in for a friend? And why is it that one might need a book in place of a friend? To answer these questions, I base my inquiry on Albrecht Koszorka's work on the cultural history of media in the 18th century. What Koszorka observes is a fundamental shift in the ways in which distance and proximity are assessed and conceptualized during the Age of Enlightenment and the rise of the middle class. Increasingly, physical closeness is regarded as undesirable, potentially harmful and dangerous. That can be in medical terms, but more importantly, it is about hygiene from a social and moral point of view. One simply has to recall all the stereotypes that surrounded the aristocratic court culture, Versailles as a cesspool of vices where the close proximity of people inevitably led to immoral behavior, but also to deceit and disguise. The best way in which an individual could be his or her true self was if they were alone. For most of human history, this meant relative isolation. The blessings of solitude came with the drawback of communicative silence. Not so in the 18th century, and probably ever since. A substantial increase in literacy, the vast expansion of the postal system, a thriving culture of letter writing, and the emergence of a public sphere in an ever-growing market for books and periodicals made it possible to be alone physically and still stay connected. These factors led to what Koschorke then calls an umfassende Schriftkultur, a comprehensive writing culture, or a culture based on the written word. Well, this is probably all well known to you. In my research, I'm looking at the impact this comprehensive writing culture had on the notion of friendship, and how vice versa, practices of friendship influenced the way in which we deal with communicative media and technology. In that context, I've uploaded 3 texts that I would like to briefly comment upon now. All of them are letters, and I should say printed letters. The first one comes from a letter writing manual that has a significant impact on the German epistolary culture, but arguably way beyond that. It is Christian Fürchtegott Gellert's treatise on good taste in letters. And what Gellert argues is that in contrast to the ways in which written correspondence was dealt with in other letter writing manuals of that time, namely as a form of administrative exchange or ceremonial representation, the private letter can and should be perceived as a form of intimate conversation. Gellert accompanied his treatise with sample letters. The one I'm displaying here is the first in this collection, and it deals with the issue of friendship. In fact, I would claim all that it does is to perform friendship. It's void of any content, but to reassure the addressee that the letter writer is indeed his friend. There was a slight problem in my translation in the version that I uploaded, and I corrected it here, I hope. It's not about the addressee being ill-disposed, but well-disposed, obviously. The next example is by the renowned anacreontic poet Johann Wilhelm Ludwig Gleim, who devoted much of his house in Halberstadt to a portrait collection of his friend. And that is, in fact, the largest surviving portrait collection of the German Enlightenment. So someone with a very wide circle of acquaintances. Gleim dubbed this collection Freundschaftstempel, a temple of friendship. In this letter, Gleim is writing to the young poet Johann Georg Jacobi, recounting the receipt of a letter and a book by Jacobi. What's interesting about this is that both objects become a replacement for the absent friend. They are kissed, caressed, fetishized. The corporal entity serves as a substitute, but also expands the possibility of prevailing morals would allow you to do with the body of a friend. At the same time, the collection that the present letter appeared in, and that Gleim and Jacobi published in 1768, was intended to promote Jacobi to the German public through the means of his epistolary friendship with the established Gleim. Thus, friendship, or the literary staging of friendship, becomes incorporated into the logic of the emerging book market. Now, the last example is probably the most familiar. It is the first letter of Goethe's Werther. One of the reasons that made this novel so incredibly successful in Germany and beyond was the way in which the reader is integrated into the book. While almost all the previous epistolary novels feature different voices, or rather pens, letters from a variety of characters, Goethe made the radical choice to present his readers exclusively with Werther's perspective. We hardly learn anything about Werther's friend, Wilhelm, the addressee of the letters, but that gives us as readers the possibility to take Wilhelm's place and read the novel as if those letters have been addressed to us. Consequently, this is a foretaste to the poetics of Romanticism, in which literature conceals the anonymous masked character of the printed book in an intimate gesture of self-expression. Now my time is almost up, and I haven't even mentioned half of the things I would have wanted to talk about, but I will simply leave you with a few ideas on this last slide to give you an indication to where this all might be going. In a lucid analysis of Goethe's letters as a young adult, Albrecht Schöne once demonstrated how epistolary writing can serve to retain and therefore intensify certain emotional experiences. The specific medium that facilitates a seemingly dialogic yet inherently monologic conversation is therefore probably not insignificant for Werther's crisis of inwardness. Similarly, the difference between monologue and dialogue should be considered in relation to the personae that social media, past and present, create. The networked self has been a catchphrase in the early studies of digital culture, but it applies just as much to the 18th century when we look at the constitution of the self through letters rather than through memoir or autobiography. And finally, by the example of Lord Byron's poetry, Tom Mole has traced the origins of celebrity culture back to Romanticism and the early 19th century. As a mere footnote to his work, I believe it is important to mention the cult of friendship in the 18th century and Germany's contribution to this cultural apparatus. That's all for now, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Tobias, for your wonderful paper. We move straight on to Bernard Geoghegan, our second speaker, and will then, at the end of his paper, open up for a joint discussion. Bernard Geoghegan is senior lecturer in history and theory of digital media at King's College London. He also curates for the Technosphere project in the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin. His research interests include cybernetics and the human sciences, the rise of networked interactive media, German media theory, the media infrastructures of spiritualism, the Anthropocene, and the history of human-computer interaction. I'm delighted that Bernard can be here with us today, and he will be speaking to us on vigilant networks, radar vigilance, and the anxious foundations of digital teamwork. His paper that was mentioned earlier, due to technical challenges, is pre-recorded, and I think Marie is in charge of that side of things.
Okay, I'm gonna try and find it. Hang on. Okay, share my screen. There it is. So we will just play Bernard's talk, and then he will be available live for question and answer, of course.
Why does networked media make me so anxious? Why does every ping on my phone carry with it a mild sense of impending doom? This anxious anticipation of disaster has a very 2020 feel about it. The pandemic and our waiting on vaccines, on technical fixes to the crisis, the California wildfires in the sense that they augur some disaster to come through climate change, waiting on a Brexit deal, the possible re-election of Donald Trump. All of these form a horizon of anxious anticipation that seem to inflect 2020, in which we find ourselves linked together in perpetual and ongoing anticipation of catastrophe. And for many of us, it is through our smartphone and its feeds that we find ourselves bound to this global network of anticipation. Not merely waiting for its announcement, but through Twitter, through Facebook, through email and Zoom, responding to its announcements in haste. We even find ourselves taking a certain pleasure in plugging into this global system and seeing ourselves as nearly heroic when we accept the ping and respond to its call with a righteous tweet or a just-in-time text message. We are not averting disaster, but in this networked environment, we have a particular way of intervening just in time at a moment's notice in chains of events which seem to stretch beyond our immediate horizon. It seems to me that this whole setup is about more than just 2020 with its pandemics and its political pileups. If anything, 2020 seems like the denouement of a deeper set of technological, economic, and political factors. It seems to me that 2020 actualizes a global restructuring of our sense of place and time, with deep connections to the uprooting and reordering of our planetary relations through networked screens demanding our vigilance. It's not that these screens are necessary, a source or engine of this global sense of anticipation, or its sense of pending catastrophe, but rather that they exemplify and catalyze these tendencies. In this respect, the pandemic triumph of Zoom seems less like a breakthrough in our global structures of temporality, our modes of being together, even as we are physically remote. Instead, it seems to activate a networked condition that pre-existed the crisis. In this interweaving of political, spatial, and medial networks, the 1950s US deployment of the SAGE air defense system occupies a decisive place. It was the first continental real-time computer network binding together thousands of soldiers in screen-based interactive digital networks, charging them with the responsibility of monitoring the US borders against Soviet attacks. Soldiers sitting before digital interactive screens could identify by means of radar intruders and set in motion the deployment of intercepting planes or missiles. If you had a chance to watch the video I pre-circulated, you have a sense of its dynamics. Here we see a representation of that network with its system of observation centers at land and sea, digitally enchaining humans, planes, and anti-aircraft systems in a system of instantaneous and continental defense. This vast digital network and its system is one reason why I see in this vast digital network and its system, I see roots of our present moment. To sustain perpetual vigilance across vast spaces, it invented the first real-time interactive computers equipped with screens, graphical user interfaces, a mouse, actually a kind of mouse gun, and other media that sustained instantaneous communication between human operators and its continental network of computers and commanders. Moreover, in rising to meet the atomic threat, which was the threat of instantaneous and vast annihilation at a moment's notice, SAGE initiated an enduring link between digital interactivity and new practices of vigilance. It linked together the digital screen with a sense of global political urgency. It inaugurated the uses of pins, pop-ups, and digital alerts to maintain engagement and to compel response by users whose action it was necessary to prevent nuclear apocalypse. There are a number of ways this system produced our digital media environment. Practically, it gave birth to digital interactive computing, the mechanisms that organize our present devices, their design, their psychological models, the digital iconography that they use, magnetic memory, and other elements that sustain both the temporality and the engagement of our current media environment. It also gave birth to the rise of the control room, innovated here we see in the SAGE system, which created a new format for information visualization, the representation of global circumstances according to local graphics and text available for command and control. In the SAGE control rooms made famous through movies such as Dr. Strangelove and War Games, we find a forerunner of our own contemporary interfaces of control adapted to the present networked moment, which is to say, we find in them a forerunner of the dashboard. Here we see Johns Hopkins global dashboard up top for monitoring the pandemic, and the Zoom dashboard down below, which can be used for monitoring your students. They draw on the iconography and temporality of global Cold War command and control systems, by which we can fashion ourselves as digital commanders, standing astride streams of global information flows. And then we see small examples of how fields such as public health and education have been innovated by vigilance shaped in Cold War command and control systems. Insofar as this poses the problem of how we as workers, scholars, and educators are implicated in these systems, the way we reproduce them, I'd like to close by citing an excerpt from Roland Barthes' 1968 instructions to students on how to complete their theses. He said, quote, "The objective alliance between the human sciences and technocracy risks erupting into the école pratique des hautes études. Faced with this, our seminar plays an oppositional role, opposition to the ideology of human sciences to technocracy. This oppositional role will never be theatrical, clear but not theatrical. It will remain by necessity within the framework of the institution." So he made these remarks to students in the wake of an agreement between the May 68 protesters and state functionaries on how to reform French higher education to make it more dynamic and interactive and responsive to social needs and social functions. Citing these developments, he reminded his students of the origins of the École pratique des aptitudes itself in the post-war triumph of the behavioral sciences, which itself was a kind of Cold War development of command and control techniques in the social sciences. The point of structuralism and semiotics, it seems to me, as Barthes was well aware, with his rhetorics of code and communication borrowed quite directly from Cold War cybernetics, which I've shown elsewhere, was not to reject the technocracy, but to work within the framework of its institution for its contestation. That is, to elaborate an internal system of opposition of which seminars and theses writing formed a part. That year's seminar on Saracen and its publications as SZ modeled one method of contesting structures of domination and control. I would like to conclude with my hopes that our own recourse to Zoom-based teaching and research will seek out similar possibilities for opposition made by necessity from within the framework of digital institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bernard, I hope you are with us. Yes, there you are. Excellent. Thank you very much. I thought it was a fantastic idea to pre-record the paper. The quality was excellent. Thank you very much. Very interesting, both your papers, and it'll be fascinating to draw out similarities and points of contact between your two contributions, Tobias and Bernard. Thank you very much again for presenting in this session. We now have about a good 20 minutes for discussion, and I would be delighted to take first raising hands, please. There's one by Lucy.
Thank you, Katja. Thank you, Tobias and Bernard. I really enjoyed that. I'm going to start with a question for Tobias. Tobias, I loved this idea of the what I think you said was a kind of like a sample letter or an exemplar letter, which, as you pointed out, was kind of, I mean, sort of devoid of content. It just had kind of a lot of, you know, nice words about the importance of friendship. And I suppose partly after listening to the papers yesterday, and I suppose I'm thinking of Lucio's paper in particular, and the idea of the sort of variation on the personal variation on a form that is given and is quite regulated. I'd be very interested to hear more from you about that idea of the kind of model letter. I mean, was that, you know, were these things sort of published as sort of guides to you as to how to write a better letter to your friends? And, you know, do you know anything about how those models were used and varied by people?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. This is coming out of the 17th century court culture in Germany, and all across Europe. But I guess in Germany it was particularly important to know how to write a formal letter, how to address certain people. I mean, there's long lists of rules depending on the relationship to someone, how you would address them, what kind of pronouns you'd use, and stuff like that. And then Gellert, he's not really the first one. Actually, the first one is A Circle Around Gleim, but Gellert is usually the name associated with this radical break of saying what we actually need to focus on is the private correspondence, and that is modeled after the way we speak with friends. So get rid of all the ornaments, get rid of all the pomp, get rid of the artificial elements in a letter and speak naturally. Nature obviously is a big buzzword around this time. What often gets lost is, and I think that's what you're hinting at, that whatever is natural or authentic in literature is always an effect of staging and artificial construction. And what I personally find very interesting about the letter that we briefly discussed is, like all the other lectures actually, they are letters of friendship, but at the same time deeply rooted in the lover's discourse. And if anything happens in the 18th century around friendship and letter writing, it is that people try to find a language for that. And I would claim that people like Gellert Orgland, they were actually struggling with finding a language that is expressive enough to fulfill this idea of turning yourself into writing. And the only discourse really that is available that does something like that is the discourse of love. And that's why for a few decades only, a very interesting tone comes up in letters that is all around kisses and tenderness and sensibilities. And then it changes. And I think there's a lot of reasons why that happens, but I'm not going to go into that and just leave it for other questions.
Okay, are there any other questions? Marie, please. And Lucia afterwards.
Sorry, yeah, I had to raise my physical hand as a host again. Yeah, thank you both very much. I think it's really, yeah, interesting how they work together. And Bernard, I have a question for basically your ending, like which is positive in a way. Like you expressed a hope that we could maybe within the institution think about like with Barthes about ways to resist the structures of domination within, and yeah, I guess the buzzword that comes to mind is complicity. And I see, I mean, Annie, I hope you don't mind that I point you out because you're in the audience, but I just read a fascinating article by Annie Ring about the possibilities to withdraw from those systems of surveillance and data raising, etc. So how do we withdraw? How do we work from within the system, basically?
Mm-hmm. So thank you. So I've been thinking a lot lately about structuralism and its spin-offs. And part of what I think is about structuralism is kind of relevant to our particular moment is, structuralism describes a situation in which we're all completely embedded in a set of rules and techniques and structures to which, we don't necessarily have freedom of action. Our freedom of action is very limited. And I think this is, in a way, an environment such as our own, where in fact it does feel like our communications, our technologies, our networks are so thoroughly determined. So the one thing I would say is, so what I like about Barthes is ultimately, I think he's suggesting we don't have so ready a possibility to withdraw, right? In the sense that we are somehow thoroughly embedded in these structures. Hence he says, we have to, by necessity, work within the institution, right? And this was partially part of this late 60s. If you think about Barthes and some of his contemporaries, they were very skeptical about the May 68 movement because they saw May 68 as posing this possibility of overturning the system, a revolution. And Barthes was actually trying to say some of this is naive, and in fact we have to think about the ways in which our resistance itself is built into the system, right? Ultimately, I guess if I sounded optimistic, that was misleading. But I do think, a kind of first step is as thoroughly as possible describing this condition of containment, this condition of subjection. And then within that, we find a system, we have to find ways of working within it that kind of, it's our small spaces of opposition through collaborative practice, through defining new possibilities within the system, as opposed to, for example, simply saying, there's as opposed to trying to simply find a way out. Does that answer the question? It's a little roundabout.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. There was a next question from Lucia.
Hi. Great. Yeah, thanks for your papers, both. And I think my question goes slightly now into a different direction again, although Sarrazin might be the bridge to Bernard, and maybe it's a little bit more for Tobias. Because I was thinking, also thinking about the discussions yesterday about alone together. How queer is this actually, or how non-normative really? And you, at the example of the letter, of course, the letter writing around 1800, modeled on the lovers' discourse, and yet these are letters of friendship between men or between women. I had to think again to, Chris, your paper yesterday, and you started with the solitude of the lovers' discourse. Again, there is something to this solitude. It's something that cannot quite be shared, perhaps also because it's censored. Of course, there is something. It's not just the discourse of love, because it's a queer discourse. We had the paper by Hannah on the beach, etc. So I'm just thinking around being alone together and the queerness of this. I mean, it's very rough in my head, but I think there is something that we have touched upon, but not really maybe explored. Or I don't know whether, Tobias, whether you had, because maybe at the example of the letter.
Perhaps the best response is a quick story. When those letters were published between Gleim and Jacobi, another friend in Gleim's circle raised her voice, this time a woman, Anna-Luisa Kausch. She is also a poet from a very different background than Gleim. Not middle class, but the daughter of a farmer, and she almost kind of asked Gleim, why don't you write letters like this to me? Why are your letters to me compared to the ones that you publish to Jacobi? Why are they so dry? What about kisses and caresses for me? And then Gleim responds by saying, but then people could believe that we actually mean it. We have to be careful if it's between a man and a woman. So I think, obviously, the written discourse, the written way of communicating opens up a door into a queer space. And the way that Gleim deals with it is that this is almost an exclusively queer space. And there's no way of kind of like letting kind of a blended sphere between those two.
Thank you.
Can I just interfere very briefly for clarification, and then we have a whole set of more comments and questions to listen to. Tobias, the whole thing of kissing and the whole erotic element in these letters is quite difficult to interpret from a contemporary perspective. So do you really think that if a man talks about kissing another man in these letters, that opens the window to some kind of queer territory, or is that not just part of what was at the time quite within normative realms? We talked about norms and digression and what happens if the norms changes yesterday, and I wondered how that may relate to the observations or the conclusions you've come to draw when looking at your material.
Yeah, I would definitely defend the use of the term queer, yet not homosexual. This is, if we follow Foucault, at time before the homosexual as a concept or a term. So it's all about practices. And yes, obviously, clearly in the 18th century, practices or between the 18th century and our present time, practices have shifted very much. For example, the kiss between friends in the 18th century is a kiss on the mouth, where the lips would touch. Something that certainly for us is more a sexual interaction. So I think it's not very helpful to think in terms of sexuality. And the question keeps being asked, was Gleim gay, for example? Did anything happen between those men? By all that we know, not. I mean, there's no documents about it, but that's also a difference in the way that people dealt with keeping record of, whatever, what you write in your diary, what kind of records exist. But I think the important point for me is that queer in the way that it allows to do something and express something that wouldn't be possible physically in the same way. There's a lot of space in these letters for friendship that is purely a virtual friendship. For 30 or 40 years, Gleim had a friendship with someone that he knew in his youth, and they keep on saying, it's going to be wonderful when we meet each other. And they had opportunities to see each other, meet each other, but they never did. And I think it's a conscious decision to keep it in this realm of distance communication through distance.
Thank you, Tobias. I'd love to pursue this further, particularly because in Truffaut there's a lot of letter writing, and I'd love to hear your views on that. But there's a whole series of raised hands which have to come in first. I apologize for using my position of power for a couple of minutes. So there's Tom, then Patrick, and Annie, followed by a few others. So Tom first, please.
Yeah, thank you very much to both of you. I really enjoyed those papers. Tobias, I have a question for you. Yeah, I was also really struck by what you just said about using a lover's discourse to transform oneself into writing. And I just wonder if you could just say just a little bit more about how these structures of letter writing, technology, proximity, and distance developed after Romanticism. And I was thinking in particular, I guess, way beyond Romanticism of, well, Kafka, and in particular Deleuze and Guattari on Kafka. They're particularly interested in Kafka's letters, and they say that these letters are designed to keep people, or actually the institution of marriage, actually, at a distance, that they're letters that are masquerading as the intimate that delay any real proximity indefinitely. And they actually call them blood-sucking vampire letters. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about how this develops.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating what you say, and to be fair, I've been thinking about the friendship between Kafka and Max Brod, obviously, but not enough about Kafka as a letter writing and as a letter writer, and I think for the whole project that I have in mind, the idea that you can keep people at bay through technology is something very important. I think when we talk about technology, we often use it in terms of staying connected, being close to each other. But the possibility to withdraw is, I believe, something that is very essential with and through technology. At the same time, when we look, and I'm just making a big jump here now to avoid talking about Kafka, when we look at the celebrity culture of the 21st century, I think technology, the ability to withdraw through technology, has not been perfectionized yet, because things like the cancel culture, for example, I think do the opposite again. You cancel someone by that kind of put this person very much into the spotlight. So I think what we're witnessing with technology is often something like an inversion of distance and proximity. Acts of distancing create proximity. Acts of proximity create distance, and this. Yeah, I guess I'd better stop it here.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Julius. We have Patrick, Annie, and Hannah as wanting to make comments, ask questions. Patrick, please, over to you.
This is a comment really on Bernie's paper, for which thank you very much. It was great. I just wanted to ask you, maybe for you to comment about the link between the early part of your paper and your last evocation of the possibility of resistance with Barthes in the context of our current moment, because I found your account of the vigilance and the anxiety in relation to digital communications very compelling, yes, the anxiety provoked by the ping of the foe, or the vibration even, and also what I'd like to call the hot potato effect. When you get an email, you need to get rid of it as soon as possible, and I think that works at quite a visceral, corporeal level. And I think what, for example, what Freud writes about anxiety in inhibition, symptoms and anxiety, about it being almost an animal response, is relevant here. So I don't know what one can do as an agent, or in terms of resistance, in that light. Given that what's at stake here is almost animal visceral responsiveness, and perhaps even a compulsion. There's a kind of jouissance aspect to this moment, or the hot potato effect. Maybe, I don't know, where there might be to explore further is in a different kind of relationship between the human and the technical digital object, which might and the animal aspect of this. That's a bit incoherent at the end, but that's my point.
So yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. I'm gonna just a brief remark. I'm gonna try to continue part of what I was saying to Marie. So again, what's interesting about Barthes' critique of technocracy in the opening to the second year of the Saracen lectures, he based, as I read it, he's describing, this threat of a kind of, let's call it technical submergence, that he says is coming from all sides. It's coming from the state, it's coming from the student protesters, and in a certain sense, this is, the École Pratique was the embodiment of a particular technocratic spirit. But when he brings this up, he brings it up in the context of how do you write a thesis at this institution. And in the rest of the lecture, a big part of what he does is he inventories all the different resources of the institution. The research centers, the library, bibliographies, the teaching assistant who is Metz. In a way, this is the way I think. I think what he's partially doing was describing this way that you can sink deeper and deeper into this technical structure. And then what he really says, when he talks about the seminar, he talks about in terms of a we, right? What we are doing. And so this is a little shift, when you start talking about the animal, what I also realized suddenly was that actually what he was also talking about is a particular type of companionship, right? A particular set of relationships we have to one another, even amidst this kind of institutional technocratic embeddedness, right? And so maybe, maybe part of the lesson of invoking that of Saracen and that quote from Barthes is also just, again, to think about how does one sink as deeply as possible into these structures, to take them quite seriously, to not suggest they can be shed, but as we move deeper into them, we can form new relationships to one another that have unpredicted possibilities. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
It's slowly coming, unfortunately, to the end of our discussion time, but we do have at least two more questions. By Annie and Hannah, please. Annie, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm sorry, I'm turning my camera back on. I think I'm a bit sick of being on video. Yeah, I wanted to say thanks, Marie, for talking about my work about withdrawing from data valence, and I think that is relevant to talk about here. I was thinking about Bartleby and Adorno and Horkheimer's reading of determinate negation in Hegel, as well as Marie's own idea of a primary rejection. So I was thinking about a leap out of complicity with sort of ambient, for-profit data valence, without necessarily having a manifesto for what comes afterwards, but simply, and this is the Frankfurt School's idea coming from Hegel, but refusing to prostitute the truth to ideology. So refusing to say, oh, well, there's complicity, but there's sort of obfuscating that because it's useful, or there's maybe something queer about engaging with the technology. And yeah, I was writing about Hito Style, the video artist, works about kind of queering or undermining really privacy focused concerns about withdrawing from surveillance, where people in extremely othered groups are obviously much more at risk when it comes to surveillance, and at the same time much more in danger of falling out of care or community support if they try and disconnect from giving up their data. So really problematizing what does it mean to say, oh, we don't want to be involved with this, where obviously it's extremely safe for some of us to be able to wonder about doing that. And I wondered if it would also be, it feels like, especially with the sort of thinking about friendship in the 18th century, feels relevant to also your question, Lucia, about queerness and being alone together. Because yeah, this is coming from some writing I've been doing about whether or not we've become cyborgs now, in the context of the virus and the lockdowns in particular. And we've seen obviously households being pressure cooked, skyrocketing domestic violence figures, but also really positive reconfigurations of strengthening relationships in other circumstances. And so I've just been writing with Emily Baker at UCL about, yeah, are we cyborgs now when so much of life has gone online for people? And we're not just talking about the cybourgeoisie, but also kind of key workers with maybe cyborg-like PPE suits that allow you to be together in the same space without transmitting the virus. Like the more of a robot suit you've got on, the more you can actually be close to each other. And we were thinking about the cyborg, obviously we're citing Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto there and saying, is this still relevant? And we were thinking about the cyborg as being especially open to affinities rather than households or identities. And Haraway develops that to a limited extent, and we were taking that further. And I was noticing she was talking about effective affinities. And as a Germanist, thinking she's clearly writing about Goethe here and thinking about how Ed and Charlotte sort of invite people into their household and they say, oh yes, help us with our garden designs, or okay, we'll change our architectural plans. So thinking about affinities for the cyborg of the era of COVID, rather than households or extremely normative, like you say, Lucia, categories of being together. Yeah. So maybe it's helpful to know about that. Yeah, those ideas I've been thinking about.
Tobias and Bernard, would any one of you like to respond in any way to Annie's comments and thoughts?
I'm going to be very brief because of the time. But again, what I really like about the invocation of the cyborg and Haraway's notion of affinities is that, which part of what she's doing is actually saying the informatics of domination is something we can embrace, right? That she's actually trying to radicalize
that other virus, how we would analyse the way governmentality is treating this one. That was really, I think it's called learning from the virus.
Unfortunately, time is almost up, but Hannah has been waiting for quite a long time, so I hope you won't mind if we go 1 or 2 minutes over time. Hannah, please make your comment, ask your question. Okay. Where is she? Have lost Hannah. Hannah, are you still there?
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes,
my internet is unstable, so if it breaks up, just make a sign and I'll turn off my video. So thank you so much. You both spoke about things that are fascinating and really interesting to me, and I wanted to just make a connection, particularly with Bernard which is Jonathan Craig's 24/7, Capitalism and the Ends of Sleep. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about text. His argument is that in an age in which we have to be on all the time, we are constantly expected to be consuming and producing at every moment of the day. Sleep remains like the last unprofitable frontier. It's like the thing that is that is so difficult is to find any kind of downtime, any kind of off, right? And that in a way he contrasts like actual sleep to the sleep mode of our devices, which is an always ready state of kind of glow, right? They're always ready to go back to work. And so I was just thinking about that, and also in relation to the idea of the epistolary, the postal epistolary maybe, or the pneumatic tube, where there's always a built-in delay and you have to wait, right? There's a kind of necessary waiting for the mail truck to arrive, or in the 20th century or whatever it was in the 18th century. And just wondering about, and it seems to me that Roland Barthes is the thinker of that kind of delay, of that kind of necessary downtime, of that sort of sleep, of retreat, and that, that late Barthes is incredibly good at helping us to think about the way, he argues that nuance is what can't be sold, right? The nuance seminar is not supposed, the neutral seminar is not meant to be published. There's something unsellable about the concept of nuance. So I just wondered if you want to comment on that, sleep and delay.
Sleep and delay. One thing I would just note in passing, what I like about your invocation of 24/7 that's important to me is actually, I feel like in my talk I probably put a lot of emphasis on technology as such, right? Whereas to signal something like the economic as a major driving, if not the driving factor of these technologies is really important. And I hadn't done that. And I kind of wish we had more time to unpack that more broadly. But then other than that, I like this idea of nuance insofar as there is this question of, we can be completely paranoid. Okay, so right now we're generating all this data for Zoom, right? Everything we're doing right now is creating new profit streams that we can't even imagine based on whatever they're capturing from us. But then there are obviously, I do believe quite strongly there are certain things that are incalculable, right? There's certain types of datas and possibilities that cannot be extracted, cannot be foreseen. And maybe the challenge you're gesturing toward with Barthes is to also to think about these types of ambiguities, ambivalences, and nuances that are strangely enough embedded within the system. I'm going to keep it short and leave it at that because it's late, but I could I find your comment really important and fascinating, and it provokes me to think.
Thank you very much, Bernard. And thank you very much again, Tobias, for two fantastic papers. And as has been the case all day yesterday, I'm hugely enjoying these discussions. So thank you very much for that too. We will now have a short break. We're a couple of minutes over time. I wonder whether we could reconvene a couple of minutes later, if that's all right, so that you've got the time to run to the kitchen, make a cup of tea, drink it, and run back. So if my co-organizers are happy with that and everybody else is happy with that, I suggest that we now have a short break and we reconvene at 2 instead of 2. So it's 2 for our next, and unfortunately I have to say from a selfish perspective, last panel, which looks at the relationality and detachment, loving, holding, and mourning. So thank you very much again for those two papers, for the discussion. Enjoy your tea or whatever a drink you may have, and I look forward to seeing all of you again at 2.
Thank you.
Thanks, Katja.
Thank you, Katja. Thank you, everyone. of German at King's College London. She's the author of a book on Arthur Schnitzler entitled Stereotype and Destiny in Arthur Schnitzler's Prose, 5 sociological readings, which came out in 2018, I think. And she's co-editor of a forthcoming special issue on the poetics and politics of refusal, which will appear in German Life and Letters early next year. She's currently working on a cultural history of distance in the 20th and 21st centuries. Her talk today is called Mourning at a Distance on the Cultural Politics of Grief and Detachment. When you're ready, Maureen.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. And yeah, today I'm going to present the idea of an article that I would like to write. So I'm not drawing on anything that I've already written. So I'm obviously, as always, really grateful for any kind of feedback. I'm going to share my screen. So this should work. My connection has been a bit spotty, so please just let me know if there are any problems. And I just jump right in.
That seems to be working well.
Good. Grief is a path to understanding entangled, shared living and dying. I've chosen this quotation by Donna Haraway as a paradigmatic example for the fact that grief and mourning have become central concepts in cultural theories that are concerned with the ethics and politics of living together. And as, for example, Daniela Agostinho and her co-editors have pointed out, this resurgence of this concept of grief in cultural theory is very much indebted to the work that has been done in Holocaust studies, which has challenged the classical Freudian understanding of grief as a successful process of letting go. And instead, mourning becomes then conceptualized as a disruption that continues to be felt. So something that changes the way we go forward rather than a return to the normal we knew before. And for Haraway, and even more so, I would say for Judith Butler, grief throws into sharp relief our shared vulnerability, which is then hoped to inform an ethics that is founded or that is based on a global sense of interdependency. And this gives us obviously a very rough and brief idea why grief may lend itself perhaps as a cultural concept for the ethics of living together. But I would like to think a bit more concretely today about what it is that grief does in order to understand why it should make us understand shared living and dying. So in the first instance, I would like to invite you to think with me about what grief does at an individual level, and then open up the question whether this very personal experience of grief can actually, and how it could, if it can, inform collective practices, which is always a little bit problematic, I think, this jump. So psychological research has shown that the experience of losing a loved one tends to come along with a sudden clarity of one's own mortality. And many of you in this round are familiar with Roland Barthes' mourning diary, which he wrote in response to his mother's death. And there you really find the sudden clarity of the subject's own mortality. And what you also find in there is that this experience sets the mourner apart from other people who seem to be living in denial of their own mortality. Let's look at Barthes for a second. He writes, "Now I see each individual under the aspect of ineluctably having to die, and no less obviously, I see them as not knowing it to be so." And we can find a similar observation much earlier in Sigmund Freud in his 1915 essay Wir und der Tod, Us and Death, where he writes that we're actually having a hard time believing in our own death. And elsewhere in a text that is concerned with the creative writing and daydreaming, he calls this the myth of His Majesty, the ego. And this myth is not only reflected in many works of Western culture, I would say, but also in contemporary political rhetorics, and therefore also probably in political decision-making. Let's revisit a moment from our very recent past. In the early days of the current pandemic, the UK Prime Minister announced that many more families would lose loved ones before their time. And many have commented on the callousness of the statement in this particular context. And one of them was the philosopher Sergio Benvenuto, who really whose comment really teased out the inherent myth of the immortal ego that is inherent to the statement, when he said, why not say prepare your lives as if death were always the death of the other? And I'd say this myth of the immortal ego keeps death at a distance. It allows the powerful machinery of business as usual to go on in the wake or in the prospect of the death of the other. And we've seen in Barthes that the experience of mourning can shatter this myth by bringing our own death close. But the question is obviously, can it also bring us closer together in our shared mortality, in our shared vulnerability, at an ethical or even at a political level? If we look again at the passage in Barthes, I'd say that it suggests that grief in the first instance seems to create a moment of detachment rather than relationality. But I'm wondering if it's maybe precisely this kind of detachment that makes grief such a powerful concept for thinkers like Haraway and Butler. Can we perhaps think of grief as an effect of potentiality that calls our own current business as usual order into question? In his lecture series, The Neutral, Barthes describes the mourner's reluctance to adhere to everyday requests, and he describes a desire for the world to be suspended. Of course, again, the central question is, can this very personal experience of grief really inform collective ways to suspend our order, to suspend the myth of His Majesty the ego that is at the root of our culture, and therefore can it really inform accountable ethical and political practices? In her latest book, The Force of Nonviolence, Judith Butler suggests that grieving takes a different form when it is a loss at a distance. But she doesn't really make explicit what form this loss, this grieving at a distance could take. And this is really what I'm interested in exploring in my article. Our first association that we may have when we hear grieving at a distance may be perhaps the response of compassion. However, the philosopher Amir Srinivasan has pointed out that in the political context, at least, compassion is too distancing, representing the suffering as not having anything to do with our own actions or positions. So an accountable mourning at a distance then perhaps means acknowledging that we are often implicated in losses that happen at a distance, and that neither the stance of compassion that is too distanced, nor maybe the over proximity of identification are apt responses. And I conclude that in my article, I will draw on Alexander and Margarete Mitscherlich's very classical seminal study from 1967, The Inability to Mourn. And here the Mitscherlichs argued that the failure of the German people to mourn the loss of their own narcissistic ego ideal that was represented by the Führer was the reason for their inability to mourn and to take responsibility for the actual victims of the Shoah. And this is obviously an extreme example of implication, but I think it teaches us perhaps that an uncountable grief work at a distance may have to start with what's closest to us, with letting go of problematic ego ideals that keep us attached to the business as usual and that may make us blind to our own implications in losses that are happening at a distance. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Absolutely fascinating. Yes, I will do this with my, thank you. We'll just move on now. Our next speaker, I'm really happy to say, is Tim Matthews. Tim is Emeritus Professor of French and Comparative Criticism at University College London. Tim's published a lot, but his most recent monograph is called Alberto Giacometti, The Art of Relation. He's recently completed a book, I believe, of creative critical writing called There and Not There, Chronicles of Art and Loss. And he's also been working on a translation of Barthes' Fragment d'un discours amoureux. His talk today is related to his translation of Barthes' work and is called Translating Fragments of a Lover's Discourse. Thank you, Tim. You need to unmute.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you.
So thanks so much. I'm just going to kick straight off. This is essentially going to be a reading from the translations that I've been doing, a very brief reading from the translations I've been doing from the Fragment. And the text of that is in the Dropbox, so the documents that Lucy put there. And I should say thank you, really, like everybody else, thank you everybody for doing this conference, the organizers as well as the participants, just in case I'm not able to say that again. So I'll be doing that reading, and here I just have some brief comments to introduce it with. Bernard, in the material he's pre-circulated from the Séminaire Sarrazin, shows about enjoying theatre and theatricality for its dynamic, troubling and shifting dimension, which consists in being able to point out its own theatricality. This links back to the dramaturgy of ancient Greece as well as Brecht. Steps upon steps in the ancient amphitheatre, as well as echo upon echo of all sorts, and the capacity to point at them and to all the masks and avatars of the imaginary. But theatre can have a different dimension as well. Chris, in the material he circulated, quotes Comment vivre ensemble, where Barthes called speech by definition direct, and for that very reason theatrical, performed, monitored, part of a tradition that is itself monitored by institutions. So now the direct and the theatrical indicate that there's no such thing as unmonitored spontaneity in the world of the word and of signs, or not in speech at least. Nor is there a capacity to point at the echoes which perform this monitoring. To speak now is to speak directly, if implicitly, of the loss of voice. Writing seems to offer an antidote or a resistance to this grief. And grief itself for a moment isn't monitored or institutionalized. Barthes writes that writing is the concordance of indirect expression and the truth of the subject. In that sense, writing is to live the grief of the loss of voice. The truth of the subject is its indirect speaking. Mourning emerges as the life of truth and loss, witnessed in the reality of writing, which is a structural as well as an existential reality. To write depends on, is paradoxically integrated with a person who is not there as you write, and who is the only person that can answer the question repeatedly asked in writing. Rather than an antidote to grief, writing is a way to live it, or a way to live a grief that lives. An odd and troubling and flickering and engaging and in an absorbing sort of way, the indirect shifts over to a certain kind of flatness. The truth of the subject remains the truth of the subject only if it remains immediate, an immediate utterance and an utterance of the immediate. And only if it remains a directly indirect and wholly imaginary concordance with each other, of everyone involved. I love you, all one word. I love you, all one word. I love you, a figure that refers to a cry of love repeatedly proffered and unrelated to a declaration or confession of love. After the first time and the first confession, I love you no longer means anything, or hardly anything more than adding a bit of enigma to an aging message. What an empty message it is by now as well, never even conveyed in those words anyway, perhaps. I keep repeating them beyond any hope of relevance. They've passed out of language, they digress. But where to? Break down the expression and you soon begin to laugh. So there's supposed to be an I on the one side and a you on the other, with a love join in the middle. And a reasonable love join as well. It has to be reasonable because it's lexical. Surely anyone can see that breaking it down like that, and in accordance with linguistic theory, defigures what's hurled out all in one go. to love doesn't exist in the infinitive, or if it does, only as a metalinguistic artifice. Subject and object come all at once in the word to love, in the moment it's proffered. We should hear it or read it like in Hungarian, for example, Szeretlek, all one word, I love you, as though French had renounced its famed and analytical beauty and were now purely a language of combinations. In linguistics, this is called agglutination, and yes, this really is all about glue. A block, the slightest syntactic alteration and it crumbles. In practical terms, it's beyond syntax. It doesn't respond to structural permutation, and it isn't the equivalent of any structural substitution, in which various combinations might produce the same point. I could go for days saying I love you all one word, without ever passing on to I love him. I'm resisting allowing the other, the one I love, to pass through syntax or through a predicate, in fact language at all. The only job of I love you is to call to him and let him expand into his name. Ariadne, I love you, says Dionysus. What are we supposed to think about suffering in the end? How should we conceive of it and evaluate it? Is suffering necessarily on the side of the bad? Is suffering in love always a matter of a reactive and belittling treatment along the lines of you must respect the taboos? What about reversing that evaluation? Could we then imagine a tragic view of suffering in love and an affirmation in the tragic of I love you, all one word? And what if love and the loving person were put back under the sign of the active? Here's a singular encounter in the German language, the same word, Bejahung, for two different types of affirmation. The one, picked up by psychoanalysis, is bound up with denigration. The child's first affirmation has to be denied, or there to be any access to the unconscious. The other, posited by Nietzsche, is in the mode of the will to power. Nothing psychological there, let alone social, and the production of difference. The yes of that second affirmation is innocent, and it has encompassed the reactive. It's an amen. I love you, all one word, is active. It affirms itself like a force against other forces. Which ones? The 1,000 forces of the world, which are all forces of denigration, every one. Science, the doxa, reality, reason, etc. Or against language. The proffering of love, I love you, all one word, is at the limit of syntax. It embraces tautology. I love you means I love you, and sets aside the bondage of the sentence. As a proffering, I love you isn't a sign, but plays against signs. Anyone who doesn't say I love you, all one word, across whose lips I love you cannot pass, is condemned to emitting signs of love that are multiple, uncertain, doubting, avaricious, and to emitting indicators of love, the proofs of love, gestures, looks, sighs, allusions, ellipses. He will have to let himself be interpreted, be dominated by the instances of reaction in the signs of love, alienated in the servile word of language because he can never say anything. Slaves have their tongues cut out and speak only in bearings and manners and facial expressions. As a countersign, I love you, all one word, is on the side of Dionysus. Suffering isn't denied, not even cries of pain or revulsion or resentment. But by being proffered, it isn't interiorized either. Saying I love you and repeating it, reaction is expelled, sent back to the mournful world of signs where nothing is heard, and to all the twists and turns of the word from which nonetheless I am never free. In being proffered, I love you is on the side of expenditure. Those that want words proffered, lyrical people, liars and wanderers, are the speaking subjects of expenditure. They expend the word as though it had been pertinent and vile for it to be recuperated anywhere. They stand at the limits of language, where language itself, what else could manage such a thing, recognizes that it offers no guarantee and that there is no safety net for its work. Thanks, I'll stop there.
Thank you ever so much, Tim. That was wonderful, really, really wonderful. Thank you. Okay, I'm thrilled to now introduce our third and final speaker, Kate Briggs. Kate is a writer and translator and based at the Pietsvaart Institute in Rotterdam. As you probably know, she's the translator of 2 volumes of Roland Barthes' lectures, lecture notes at the Collège de France. And her recent work includes a book called This Little Art, a long essay on the practice of literary translation. And interestingly, entertaining ideas, a short essay on writing backwards. Today, Kate's going to be talking to us about the long form. Kate, you need to unmute yourself. Classic.
Absolutely.
Sorry, sorry. Just I managed to be able to mute and unmute and video and on and off all the way through, and then when it comes to my moment to speak, thank you. What I was about to say, launch into saying, was just thank you for the invitation to join you. And I have been in kind of dark screen over the course of yesterday, most of the time in kind of trying to preserve bandwidth, but I've been very much listening and engaged by all the work. So thank you. And thank you also for the last two papers. I'm just going to offer a kind of set of dispatches from a work in progress titled The Long Form. And perhaps in the arrangement of quotations which I provided ahead of time, you might already get a sense of kind of where my interests are, or at least the kinds of texts I'm working with and ideas I'm working with, and how I'm trying to set them in relation to each other. So in this sort of short presentation, I'm just going to speak a little bit more about that project, what I wanted, I'm hoping that it might do, and to contextualize it in relation to the book that Tom mentioned, This Little Art, which was a book about the practice of translation. And in that book, at a certain point, kind of towards the end of the book, I've become interested in what it is to take responsibility for something or for someone that can't be expected to take responsibility for you. So where responsibility is kind of asymmetrical and not reciprocal. And that seems to me to characterize the kind of dynamic involved, the situation of translation, but also the situation of early years childcare. And one word for early years childcare, one form that it can take is, of course, I say of course, perhaps that's the point, perhaps it shouldn't go without saying, but one word for this is motherhood. And I noticed that Hannah, in the materials she circulated around her talk about the beach effect, used the phrase state-sponsored narratives of belonging and co-belonging and becoming. And among the state-sponsored narratives of co-belonging and becoming, perhaps motherhood would be the one par excellence, in the sense that it's sentimentalized, scrutinized, called upon to act as a potent symbol of whatever the caller requires it to act as a potent symbol of at that particular moment. I would say symbolically kind of overburdened and overdetermined, and at the same time radically undersupported, at least in material terms, undervalued, underthought, underrepresented, I would say, within the spaces of kind of grand theorization, with of course the exception of some key works, particularly by feminist thinkers. So that's something I am interested in motherhood, but I guess I'm going to be qualifying what I mean by that and where my interest lies. I would say I'm interested in what it is, in trying to write about what it is through fiction, in fact, what it is to live with alongside a baby or next to a baby, to use Tom's phrase from yesterday, over time. A situation of dependence involving the necessary recognition of what D.W. Winnicott calls the fact of dependence, which begins with the recognition of someone else's need and vulnerability. There was talk yesterday about the individual, the category of the individual, the kind of fantasy of the individual as a kind of bounded subject. I think what's interesting about babies is the way that they pose a problem to that fantasy. Winnicott also famously says, you know, there's no such thing as a baby. A baby doesn't appear or can't appear, or if it could appear, it would be fatal. Fatal to the preservation of its life if it were to appear alone. So a baby implies a couple, the baby with its carer who might be at some distance, somewhere close by, kind of in the vicinity. There's no such thing as a baby, therefore kind of maybe presents a problem of for our notion or our fantasy of the individual, but also for the novel, perhaps, in the sense that the novel, at least in its kind of English language emergence, has been very interested in the category, kind of promoting the category of the bounded, named individual. And that might be why in a fantastic book by Rivka Galchin called Little Labours, she, which is about babies, living with babies, she writes, literature has more dogs than babies and also more abortions. Most babies who appear in literature are, by paragraph 3, already children, if not even adults. So part of this project is to try and stay with a baby as a baby for a while. A baby who's vulnerable, whose rhythms are unpredictable, not yet synced with the kind of grand diurnal working rhythms of adult kind of capitalist productivity, whose mind and very being can seem strange and unknowable. So needy, unpredictable, untimely, vulnerable. The thinker I've been working with a lot is a feminist thinker called Sarah Ruddick, who published this book in the 80s called Maternal Thinking. And she defines a baby, I think, really interestingly as an open structure. So I'm thinking of the fact or the kind of physical being of a baby, but of course, open structure sort of opens up the possibility that this open structure could also not present as a baby. You know, whenever we have a being who is demanding, needy, unpredictable, untimely, and vulnerable that we might be living with, which might be another human, might also be a non-human, we have something of this dynamic. So my approach to this form of living with or living alongside and adjusting to does have something in common, I think, with my approach to thinking about and trying to describe the activity of writing translations. Because on the one hand, I do want to try and get at what's really specific to this action and activity, the doing of this, and the doing of this thing, and the living out of this thing, of this relation rather than any other. But at the same time, both with translation and with in this new book project, it's been very important to me to try and pull out and kind of show to what degree the actions and gestures and habits and forms of attention that these kinds of work require are also kind of shared and shared across and kind of coextensive with other sorts of actions and other forms of living and doing. So in other words, like, living with a baby, I don't think that the kind of gestures and rhythms and forms of attention or the questions or the problems that this involves are exclusive or limited to this life situation. You know, not at all. They are shared, they're distributed, they're coextensive, they're continuous, but there is something about their repetition and their compaction and their dailiness and their duration that makes them thick and that gives it this density and a kind of particularity to this particular form of life. I want to think about motherhood actually a bit like plywood, which might sound unlikely, but I'm sitting here every day on my table made from plywood, which is a material composed of, as you probably know, thin layers, which are relatively kind of insubstantial and flimsy if you were to take them on their own, but precisely they're pressed together and layered And actually with plywood, what's interesting is it's the alternation of the grains that makes the material strong. So thinking of motherhood as kind of compacted like that, of sets of gestures, which forms questions which are also to be found in other kinds of life situations. So my project in this work in progress is to try and set the long form of living with a baby alongside the long form of the novel. You know, but for Barthes, as you know, like that, this is a title obviously taken from his course on the novel, although this is a book which is going to try very hard never to cite Roland Barthes, but for the long form just to be a kind of holding device or a kind of pointer for those who can find those relationships or are interested in finding those relationships with Barthes' work. Yeah, I'm aware actually of how much I wanted to say, and I'm probably going to take a, you know, I need to go a bit faster, I think, and accelerate. Perhaps, so I want to try and think the long form that is living with a baby alongside the long form that is the novel, and to try and show or demonstrate what I feel are the ways that those two forms might speak to each other, or have something to say to each other, or indeed kind of illuminate each other. But just to clarify this, I'm not interested in at all actually making any kind of sort of false equivalence between books and babies. Certainly not in the way that gets phrased, the kind of discourse which is often something that's actually generated by women themselves or kind of directed at women as a kind of dilemma or a life choice for the woman writer, you know, to say, look, I haven't birthed a book, but I have birthed a baby, or there's no book, but here are my children. So that's not at all the kind of equivalence I want to make, I hope for reasons that are obvious. But what matters to me more is something more like an intensive, affective, situation of address, of living in and living with a situation of addressing and being addressed. There's talk of interlocution yesterday. It's an interlocutional situation which is intensely vulnerable, or can be intensely vulnerable. And I'm thinking there of, perhaps you know Claudia Rankine's book Citizen, where she thinks by Judith Butler about around the question of why does it hurt? Why does language hurt? And it's because of a kind of openness, of a being in a condition of addressability. This is how we live our lives. We address and we are addressable. But obviously, some forms of address have different qualities, different durations, and different impacts in relation to others. And I guess to speed up, because I didn't time myself, I would say...
Got a couple of minutes.
Have I? Okay. Would say that I'm interested in a situation of address that has length and duration. I'm very interested in John Dewey. I've got my range of books here. And I'm interested in the speaker yesterday David, who was talking about Ruskin, and to see whether he has any interest in Dewey, because for Dewey, he's thinking about his task in these lectures, which he wrote in the 1920s, was to recover, I'm quoting, the continuity of aesthetic experience with normal processes of living. So for him, an aesthetic experience could be an example, thinking of the botany paper yesterday, a housewife caring for her plant and watching it grow. It could be the spectacle of a fire engine rushing by and feeling arrested by that. It could be the looking at a painting. So so Dewey is there in the sense of thinking about a kind of being held within the context of one's life, situated in the context of one's life, but also being held by situated by other kinds of forms, demanding of attention. And I guess very grandly, if I were to phrase it grandly, well, why not phrase it grandly? My task in this book is to try and recover the continuity of the aesthetic experience that I think the material kind of structuring device of a novel makes possible, as a bag, as a sack, as a capacious, lasting, portable container, with some of the normal processes of living, and to try and think and write the one in relation to the other. And when I'm flagging bag, sack, container, bottle, board, I'm thinking of Ursula Le Guin's kind of wonderful feminist revisionist story of the kind of first cultural object being something like a baby sling or a net bag, and it being a kind of one way of thinking of what the novel does as a kind of durational holding device. And maybe just some last things to throw out in the air before I end is to say, holding what it is to be held by something, to hold to something. Of course, in the background there is Barthes' seminar in Comment Vivre Ensemble, Tenir un discours, where holding to or holding forth, these are forms that can be also oppressive. They can be forms of tyranny. There's no, holding doesn't necessarily need to be something that's positive, or what it is to be arrested by something when one wouldn't want to be arrested by something, but be compelled by the kind of physical presence by another, the way that one's attention can be claimed. So I'm interested in holding as a kind of dynamic of power, a distribution and maintenance of power. But I'm also very interested, and perhaps this comes back to tact and handling, which was mentioned yesterday, in holding as Winnicott defines it, and the way that Winnicott puts the very common, very kind of everyday situation of a carer holding a child as something, as being of serious interest. And this is not metaphorical yet, this is of serious kind of lived interest, and it's happening around us all the time. And it's also something that hopefully we have each experienced, in the sense that we have each been held. Someone's done that work of holding for us, to the extent that we are able to function as adult beings. The way that he looks at that with serious interest, but then in his work expands the forms that holding could potentially take. So holding then becomes a word for kind of other situations of sustained care and attention. A form of holding that for him has to be sustained enough for the being held to kind of believe in it and to trust in it, but also open and loose and alive and responsive enough for that being to feel it possible to reach out beyond its sphere and to start touching at the world and to start becoming interested in it, to the extent that they might want to imagine more of it, and in this sense exceed it, and perhaps even to act upon it and to change it. Holding spaces for Winnicott are spaces in which we feel, or which we're given to feel, that life is worth living. And perhaps I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Kate. I'm going to give you the yellow hands again.
Thank
you. Thank you ever so much. What a wonderful panel. Really, thank you ever so much, all three of you. Now, let me just make sure I can see people. We have some time for some questions. This is always the moment where the person chairing says that, and then there are no questions, and then they sort of come. But Tobias. Oh, cool. Lots of hands now. Okay, Tobias was first, so go ahead, Tobias.
Inversion. So thank you very much for three really fascinating, very different yet similarly mind-inspiring papers. My question is to Marie, and it struck me when you talked about grief and the suspension of order, and it made me think of one of the lines of poetry that I find personally probably one of the strongest expressions for the feeling of grief, and this is Nichts stockt, both in Büchner und Tod, but then also picked up by Paul Celan in one of his poems. Nothing thickens, nothing stops, nothing falters, and I'm just wondering. I always understood this line of poetry as the idea that grief is being confronted with the fact that nothing stops. You feel this loss, the world goes on. And that seems slightly to contradict what you were saying, but I'm not sure. And just want to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah. Thank you, Tobias. No, that's kind of in line with what I had in mind. I mean, let me briefly see if I have actually Barthes' actual comment that I had in mind. Yes, he says in the neutral, I can't suspend my presence to the world temporarily because the world is pitiless, tireless, deep into mourning, so and so continues to ask me imperiously what I think of his text, etc. The world goes on. So I think this is quite a nice mirroring of the line that you just quoted by Gleim. I guess what I just hear my internet is unstable. I hope it stabilizes. Okay, let's see. Yeah, I guess what I had in mind is that this basically the stance of the mourner is a desire for potentiality, and the problem why the problematic experience that is inherent to this is because the rest of the world is living under under this kind of, maybe one could say, veil of that keeps death at a distance, perhaps. And I guess what I had in mind was like the idea of a cultivation of that stance that that creates more room, more space for suspension. And I think it's I mean that's I guess where my is that making it a bit clearer?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Corinna, I think that you have a question.
Yes, thank you everyone for your wonderful papers. My comments are for Kate. And I had a lot of ideas as she was speaking, so I'll try to keep it short. When you were talking about setting the long form of living with a baby alongside the long form of the novel, what came to mind immediately was the Bildungsroman, right? Because you build the life of a baby, and then there is also the long form of the novel, which is the tradition of the Bildungsroman, which is precisely about a life growing and developing and integrating in society. But the alternative to that, the alternative to Goethe is, of course, Lawrence Stern, right? With Tristram Shandy, where is this chapter where, you know, the parents prepare to go to bed and, you know, to engage in some activity, and then the mother says, or the woman says, well, have you remembered to wind the clock, right? And the man says, oh, you know, man, whoever in the history of the world has stopped a man in his, you know, in his tracks to ask such a question. But then this becomes a problem for the form of the novel itself. That's why the novel is so chaotic and there is no order, and the novel becomes, as you say, a portable container. So I find the idea very productive. And of course, there is Lukács's 1911 essay, Soul and Form, which is precisely a dialogue about Goethe versus Stern, right? The chaotic, the sprawling, the unruly, the uncontainable versus the organic form, the order, the tidiness of a novel that develops organically, right? And then on the other hand, if we take it from the side of motherhood, there are all these books that have been published in recent years about motherhood. Lauren Elkin has an article in the Paris Review, I think in 2018, why all these books about motherhood, and there is a full list there, so I will not go for it. But your idea of the novel as a portable container made me think of Sheila Hetty's How Should a Person Be and Motherhood. Her books usually are so many things in one, right? The plays, novels, journals, if you think of only of how should a person be. And ostensibly, this book, for example, prefers to be a quest for existential meaning and what it means to be a person. And then motherhood, which is actually about not becoming a mother, right? But then having to consider and to put in a book all these things that go into deciding whether one ought to become a mother or not. Mm-hmm. So I'll stop there. But I think that the Elkin essay has plenty in it to
yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for engaging with it. It's interesting in terms of, I guess the key text, the kind of tutor text for me in this project is actually Tom Jones, The History of a Foundling. And the reason for that, there are kind of lots of reasons for that, but A few of them are to do with the fact that it begins with a baby found under the covers, and it stays with that baby for a bit longer than kind of a paragraph. It stays with it, cares for that baby for a little bit longer. But also, it's a novel, a kind of self-conscious kind of founding moment in the emergence of the genre of the novel and its kind of English language emergence, that productively, I think, can't take for granted what a novel is, because it's in the process of defining for the first time on its own terms the kind of features and the contours and preoccupations of this new province of writing. But at the same time, I think, interestingly, through its plot, it doesn't take for granted either, or seem to know what a mother is. One of the plot devices is like, who is Tom's mother? Did he sleep with her? Hopefully not, and he didn't. But even when we discover, who the biological mother is, that really doesn't seem to matter, because mothering has in some form already happened. So it has those, and the kind of further interest for me is the fact that here is a kind of origin, a kind of self-declared kind of origin of the genre, a kind of setting out of the principles of the form for the future that is already compound, that's already combining fiction and essay, from the beginning, that's already got those two things operating in relation to each other. So to set that alongside kind of Barthes' fantasy of the novel, which is this kind of ongoing continuity, this kind of flow, this consistent thing, mayonnaise-like thing that he is dreaming of, which is no longer the fragment, no longer the kind of interrupted compound thing. I'm quite, interested. I guess in my fantasy, the fantasy of the novel would be something that has a particular sort of continuity, a kind of capacity to hold. One thing I was going to say, but leapt over, is the way a novel, the way it's possible, kind of in everyday life, to say, what are you reading? What are you reading at the moment, Corinna? And for you, or you to ask me that, and I could say right now, Tom Jones, and that would have some credibility, even though clearly at this very moment I'm just talking with you through a screen, I'm not actually reading. So that question seems to have a relationship to me to, who do you live with? That question that Barthes asks in Comment vivre ensemble. There is continuity of the relation, there's a sustaining of the relation through interruption, and it's that kind of continuity and discontinuity, which I think is kind of particular and sort of defining of the relationship, what it is to live with a baby. That I see as kind of productive to kind of think the novel through and with. And you're right, of course, that there's been a kind of explosion of thinking about the condition or the question of what it is to be a mother or become a mother or not. I suppose I would situate this book, and my hope for this book, one thing I find with the books I've read in the genre is the ways in which motherhood can be presented as kind of pertaining to itself, kind of back to itself, to those who are already invested in this life situation, or might be. It's relevant to you and to those who are already concerned. And what I hope to do is kind of open up the sphere of concern to say, this is an interesting scene, life scene to think with, and think, what can we think about through this and with this? And for me, then that's very aesthetic and literary, and actually I want to think the novel, but of course there's many other things that you could try and get to if you take that sort of life situation as a potential ground for philosophizing, in ways that perhaps, I don't see happening so much. I think in Hetty, interestingly, but not so much in other forms of contemporary mother writing. But thank you.
Thank you. Hannah, I think that you're up next.
Thank you. Wow, let me lower my hand. Thank you so much for those beautiful papers. And I just also wanted to speak to Kate, I guess most, and this is a topic that's also very close to my heart. I've been thinking a lot about care work, and as many of us have since the pandemic began, it's impossible for anyone who has normal care work duties, it's impossible not to be thinking about it just all the time now, and thinking about the absence of that scene from the literature that we study. And so I was thinking, first of all, why the novel? Because it seems like for anyone who spent time in the infancy period, like there's nothing less novelistic. Or maybe this is partly the perverse pleasure of the topic, but like there's nothing, I mean, it's so deeply, it's like it's a period of time that you almost immediately forget. It's broken up. It's a fragmentary, the time with the baby, it's like you're supposed to divide it into sleeping, eating, play, over and over again, just over and over again. It's deeply boring. So there's something about that. It almost like it requires haiku or some other form, a long form. That's just the first point. And then just briefly, I've been thinking a lot since becoming a parent myself about that one moment in Barthes' Comment vivre ensemble, the text that you translated, that moment when he defines, one of the ways he defines idiorhythmy is in relation to seeing a mother, he presumes to be a mother, walking her child right along the street and pushing the stroller with one hand and pulling the child along with her. And he says the child is forced, she's going at her own pace, at her own rhythm. This is power, and the poor child is forced to trot along with her. And since becoming a parent, I just feel for that mother. I feel she's so misunderstood, right? It's like he can only imagine the point of view of this child being, and who knows where she's trying to get that kid to, right? But anyway, so I just wondered if you had any comments about that scene and about this question of the non-novelisticness.
In relation to that scene, in the preface to my translation of Comment vivre ensemble, and also in the book, This Little Art, indeed that mother as being kind of the disruptor, in the sense of that dynamic, the one who's not in sync, absolutely is present. So I've written about that, yeah, for sure. It's interesting, that's the way the kind of mother appears in a book, in a lecture course asking about comment vivre ensemble, which is profoundly interested in living with children, actually. They don't otherwise feature except in that scene. So yeah, for sure. In terms of why the novel, I think because I think it's the sort of sets of trying to sort of pull out the sets of questions or kind of ongoing preoccupations of the novel, a certain tradition of the novel, which is clearly kind of English language, actually, predominantly a Western tradition of the novel, but thinking about the sorts of questions that it's been interested in, like how to deal with time, what time feels like. Ian Forster, in his aspects of the novel, talks about, makes the definition of the novel in relation to the story. What makes the difference between the story and the novel has to do with time, with its treatment of time. Now, as you say, the way that the days get longer or collapse into each other, or the way that the kind of non-diurnal baby is forcing you to collapses time, smashes time, I think. But living with a baby is a way of knowing time. And that's been an argument that's been made for the novel as a form, as a long form, is it gives you a kind of material sort of a kind of a way of knowing and experiencing time. And so there would be for me, a point of touch between this long form and that long form. Another would be the question of fictional minds, of other minds, what it is, the degree to which it's possible to know another, or to know and to think, with or for another. And that seems to me an incredibly present, pressing question, living with children, living with babies particularly, who are kind of pre-linguistic, so, space binding in that sense. So there would be another point of continuity. So it's about actually saying, here is a set of questions that I think living with a baby brings you up against. And it seems to me, this is my intuition, so this is my kind of, the effort of the book, is to say that these questions, they share territory, interestingly. They kind of trespass over into what have been some of the key, a handful of the key questions of this genre that we call the novel. So that would be the reason why the novel, yeah. But thank you for your question, because yeah. And also, I guess it's a novel, just as, it's a novel built of small parts. In a way that even Barthes, thinking with his fantasy of the long form, when I look at, I know there's À la Recherche, but there's also War and Peace, as the other kind of fantasized. And you look at War and Peace, and it's a novel built of small parts, like at the level of its composition. And that too, I think, how do you achieve length? how do you achieve length compositionally as a writer is through a kind of, accumulation of smaller parts. And there too, I would find a kind of point of contact, of touching with or where I think a situation of living a baby has something to say, something to reveal about the long form of the novel.
Okay.
Thank you.
And thank you for your answer, Kate. Anya Neumann, can I see you on here?
Yes, I think
yes,
so.
hello.
Yeah.
please go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. This is a kind of practice of thinking together, I guess. I was struck by how you refer to Butler and her comment on that grief takes a different form, but that she's rather unspecific and doesn't really talk about what kind of form, what kind of social practice or cultural practice that might be. And so I was thinking, you also raised the question, what kind of ethics and politics could come out of this if we think about grief as at a distance, as a shared practice in the form of sociability. And then I wondered if we think about our current moment, and you did that in part, but if we think more concretely about forms of grieving, especially in situations where we can't attend to all the rituals we usually do, we often can't attend to funerals, and that we have to come up with new practices. And I know that's not necessarily the form of grief Butler is referring to, but I'm just thinking about my own experience of starting to write in order to understand the entangled and shared living and dying of that particular person, or how I was implicated in the situation. So I started writing to a lot of people. And so, yeah, I wonder whether it's, as I said, it's an impossible question. I wonder whether you had any comments on that, or already some intuition of in which direction your article might take you.
Yeah, thank you, Anya. I think this is a very beautiful common question. And obviously I don't have like a master plan of grief in mind yet, but and I guess the end of my talk was going into a slightly different direction, but it is nevertheless obviously very much inspired by what is happening right now and by the experiences you were referring to. And I think what you just said about writing connects beautifully to Tim's translation, and when he said, like, quoted Barthes, basically wrote from his Barthes translation, that writing is not an antidote to grief, but a way to live it. So that connects me. That's terrible, because I don't know where this quotation comes from. It might be Audre Lorde, but I don't know. So please, and I think I have it from Sarah Ahmed. So there you go. This quotation of that criticism is a labor of love. I don't know if anyone recognizes that.
It's Ahmed.
Ahmed, this is Ahmed herself. Yeah, okay. So thank you. Yeah, so that's, I think that might be, for example, a way forward. I mean, if you're saying that if you're going into that direction of writing, and yeah, I think that's maybe that. I think, okay, let's just say, I think writing as a form of grief work is a very interesting path to explore, like what you're suggesting. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. Patrick French.
Yes, sorry. I wanted to ask Tim about maybe if you could reflect upon, in the light of the papers we heard earlier about friendship, the paper we heard earlier about kind of mediated friendship, if there's a way of thinking about your experience of translating Barthes in that light. And second part of the question is, I know you may have done the work before the pandemic, but how that, this is a very vague question, but how it's affected your practice of translation. if it has?
Well, those are very, very evocative questions, you know, which is the obverse of vague, which is great. It puts you on the spot slightly, I think, as a translator. Your first question, you know, could I think about these things in terms of friendship or something? It's I think if you're motivated to do a translation, you know, and there are all sorts of reasons why you would want to do that for a commission or something. But if you would motivate internally to do a translation, which is no better than any other motivation, and I feel kind of presumptuous saying this, but you do feel a kind of friendship with the voice that you wish to translate. Otherwise, you know, I might not bother. So there's oddly that this question of, you know, that 4D question in translation comes up again of fidelity, of faithfulness, you know, but it is recast. The question is recast in terms of fidelity to what, you know, what is it that you would like to honor? Why would you like to honor that? What is the best way of doing that? You know, so it's those sorts of questions rather than, you know, how accurate or inaccurate. I mean, I think I'm being incredibly accurate, but nonetheless, I'm being accurate to a certain way of hearing things, and that way of hearing things has to do with, you know, fantasies about, you know, having met Roland Barthes and being good friends and being and understanding each other. But in fact, it's a friendship that is actually based on distance, you know, and in a way, translating this book is kind of concordant with, to use his word, with what he says about the truth of the subject and its indirectness. You know, your friendship has to do with, or this way of thinking about friendship, it has to do with not both hearing another voice and understanding that you're hearing it as your own. You know, so it's a very problematic and very tight line to draw, but also a very mobile line to draw, and I think it's something to do with that mobility. So if writing is a way of living a grief, which is I hadn't started my reading yet, by the way. That was a quotation from, I mean, it was something that I came up with. But it is a way of commenting on what I was doing translating. So in a way it all merges. But so I think at the foundation of this book, there is a sense of, you know, love and friendship as being driven by grief in some way, and I think, you know, translation is involved in that. That's what I wanted. How I wanted translation to be involved in it. As to how the practice has changed now, you know, that's enormously difficult to say. One of the many things to which I don't know the answer about this moment. I do feel somehow it is even more important to me than ever, because I'm working on other translations as well at the moment. It's just important to me to get it what I call right, you know, to give voice to this voice that otherwise might not be heard, even though Roland Barthes is much better known perhaps than other writers. Nonetheless, I feel I'm translating it in order to bring out the voice as I hear it, which needs to be brought out, and I want that to be right. I want to bring that voice out because I think it matters, and I'm not quite sure why I would, particularly because the book is grief driven, is grief stricken, it is grief driven, and quite how that rebuilds community in a time like this is still. Marie's asking the same question. I mean, I'm still I don't know the answer to that yet.
Thank you, Tim. We're running out of time a little bit. We've got a few more minutes and two more questions or comments. Zuna, I think that you were next.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for all these wonderful papers, which I really enjoyed listening to. And I have a question for Marie. And it's a bit related actually to Corina's talk yesterday about Jenny Eppenbeck's novel, Go Went Gone. So I found it really interesting, the question that you asked, Marie, about what grief does at a collective level. And in your paper, in your talk, you approached this question by in the context of the current pandemic. But when I read your abstract and when I listened to you talk, it made me think also of the current migration crisis and how this current crisis kind of demands us to mourn people that we don't know. So mourn people and tragedies that kind of happen at a distance, although they are, of course, coming closer. And in my experience, that demand to mourn migrants are often voiced through internet and through social media, by way of like narratives and images and campaigns for raising funds and raising awareness, etc. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about internet or social media as kind of a fertile ground for this dissemination of mourning narratives, or as a place for collective mourning. Is that clear?
Thank you. Yeah, I have a kind of related comment that is to, yeah, like, and maybe not the head-on answer to your question, because I haven't thought about it in detail with what social media does in this context. But you're completely right that it is so vital right now. But what I've seen on social media, in response, for example, to the so-called migration crisis and what's happening like in Moria, or has happened, is that this is not Europe. Like, this is something that I've seen in several times, that this is not Europe, therefore we need to do better. But I think, and this is related to the end of my talk, maybe the problem is that this is Europe. And that we want to distance ourselves from what's happening by kind of creating this ego ideal of Europe, and saying this is not Europe, so let's do better. And obviously the intention behind it, I'm completely behind this as well. But I'm just wondering if it's helpful to go at it that way, if it's not more helpful to say this is exactly Europe, because Europe is a white supremacist structure that doesn't, in Butler's terms, doesn't, where the bodies that are washing up on our shores are not as grievable as white bodies. And so I'm wondering if it's, yeah, if the grief work that needs to be done again is maybe to kind of mourn that ego ideal of Europe as a kind of coherent, ethical community that is in somehow more responsible, or more than it is. So yeah, that would be my comment that came immediately up when you were asking your question.
You have to now.
I was so taken aback and shocked that I forgot to unmute myself. Yeah. Thank you so much, Tom. I know exactly what it feels like to see all these hands and then get messages at the same time. You're doing a fantastic job. Thank you very much. I keep it very brief because I'm conscious of time and things. And in a way, my question has been responded to already. The question was for Tim, and I hugely enjoyed this entire session. I thought the three papers spoke to each other in an incredibly wonderful way, and I wanted to encourage that even more by bringing you, Tim, in direct conversation with Kate, And I thought when you presented, I found it was quite wonderful how your own writing, how you moved in and out of your own and Barthes' writing, and at some point I even had to check where your own thoughts stopped and Barthes in your translation, of course, began. And since one of the themes throughout this workshop has been the relation or the dynamics, the tension between proximity and distance, I wanted you to elaborate a little more on your relation to the written word. I think I read somewhere in Kate's book, This Little Art, that translation could be understood as, you know, the ambition might be, and she engages with that quite critically, if I remember correctly, the ambition might be that you begin to inhabit the words of the other, and in order to make it a really good translation, you should do it as if you had written it yourself. And if I remember correctly, Kate critically engaged with that idea of, you know, identification of the voice of the other, and instead try to think about something that brings me back to my own topic, or, you know, a topic that is being shared amongst many of us here, the topic of tact as the opening up of space between your own ideas, your own thoughts, your own words, and those of the other, that you then would explore mutually together, as much as you can do that with, you know, text on the page. So, you know, I would like very much for you to elaborate a little bit on that, and perhaps also Kate, if she's still around and if you can, to respond to that in a way. You have to do that very quickly because we're running out of time. Tom, you must interfere, but if you could do that, I would be very grateful for that.
I don't think anybody will mind if we just for a couple of minutes. So.
I think you know, thank you so much. I mean, I think it goes you know, like everything going on goes to the heart of the matter. I think, you know, I'd like to start by saying, you know, that or saying something about you know, the decision to translate in the first place, or the gesture, you starting that, and without going into it much, I just wanted to emphasize that, as far as, you know, in my experience at the moment, you know, translation is a mode of thought. It is a way of thinking into the text, thinking about the text, thinking what the attachment is to it that I have, trying to communicate that attachment and that importance. So it's a mode of thinking as an impetus to thinking, as well as an impetus to writing and to communicating. So I think that's quite important, actually. And maybe I could add that, you know, on this occasion, the project in my head grew out of a course I was doing on Roland Barthes, and you know, the fact that students are reading in English a lot, even if they're, you know, specialists in French or whatever. And you know, for various reasons, I had to, you know, as you all know, you basically need to do it chronologically, you know, and it's much harder, you know, the words are much harder at the beginning, you know, and I kept saying to them, yeah, well, you'll be fine, and later on, if the writing is more accessible, you'll be fine. And they still didn't get it. It still wasn't accessible to them when we got to the fragment. And and I could see it coming. There was a classic moment. I could say, well, try reading it in French and see what happens to you, you know, and which is not trying to sort of kick out of touch previous translators, but because every translator is working for a particular community, you know, and that community may not be appropriate anymore. And so, as I say, for translation is a way of thinking into the text and thinking how to work with it and work with others through it, and myself and my own attachments. As to the kind of just drift between voices, you know, one thing I've felt in, you know, the quite limited experience of translation that I have, I mean, very limited, is you know, and this is a platitude of all platitudes, there really isn't a right answer, you know. I mean, if identification is bad, it is, because it's appropriative, but you can't proceed without it, on the other hand. fidelity is bad because it ties your hands. Complete improvisation is a completely different activity. So, you know, it's a very, very, I mean, literally speaking, it's a fluid position to try and adopt. And I think, to be a translator, I mean, and I think simply has got to be accepted. You know, you've got to take the flak, as it were, from all sorts of completely justified positions, and that's fine. You know, it is a melting pot for people's projections and resentments and desires and attachments, and it's not so much that there isn't a right answer, there isn't one that can be, you know, fortified, and, you know, that's not what it's about. It's, you're only ever going to be hearing what it is, or translating what it is that you hear, I think, as a person. And to that extent, there would be a drift between one's writing and one's translating.
Okay. Kate, do you want to add anything?
Maybe it's very important to reaffirm what Tim's just been saying about translation as a mode of thinking. I think that's what I was trying to say about the kind of compaction or thickness of questions, actions, gestures that give rise to a body of thinking. And I think translators know things as a result of this. Likewise, I think people who look after babies know things. You know, there's something about a kind of forms of doing that produce knowledge, and know particular kinds of things that have, or are interested in particular kinds of questions that have special consequence to them, but also, you know, pertain outside of their sphere of activity. So absolutely. What Katja referred to was a criticism made of the Germanist Helen Lowe Porter. She, the way that she wouldn't send off her translations until she felt she had written the book herself. And although I do kind of query and wonder over that, but I also kind of affirm that, that indeed, and it's extraordinary how hard that, am I still good, Tom? Yeah. But just that, you know, the fact that Morning Diary was written in its English language manifestation by Richard Howard, you know, How to Live Together was written by me. It's true, and also wasn't in a complicated way, but also was. I mean, it's also right that as a translator, you do write the book yourself. So you're right that there's a kind of worrying around what that means, but also an affirmation of what might it be to take seriously what that means. And I think that's still in progress. You know? Yeah.
Thank you ever so much to all of you. We have gone over time a little bit, which, well, we needed to. It was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. So can I suggest that we, I think that the final sort of closing discussion was supposed to start at 3:45. I think that it would be good if we could start at 3:45. So is everyone okay just to have a sort of 5-minute rush to do whatever we need to do and come back in 5 minutes or so? Is that okay with everybody? All right. Okay. So thanks again, and see you in 5 minutes.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. It's just 3:45, so it falls to me to just begin this final discussion, which in some ways I would see as a continuation of the discussion that was coming up and covering some very, very interesting questions at the end of that last panel. I was very moved by that last panel, and I want to thank all three of the people who spoke in it. It's really nice that panel came last, I think. It's just 3:45, so it falls to me to just begin this final discussion, which in some ways I would see as a continuation of the discussion that was coming up and covering some very, very interesting questions at the end of that last panel. I was very moved by that last panel, and I want to thank all three of the people who spoke in it. It's really nice that panel came last, I think. I mean, maybe, you know, we should pat ourselves on the back as organisers for putting that panel last, because I think something that's come out of that panel is a great of possibility and of action and of affirmative times joyful, at times grief-stricken, but forms of action and forms of hearing each other and putting that listening to each other and attunement to other people somehow to work and make visible in the world, in the work, for example, of Tim and Kate, which is ongoing. So I feel that the last panel of the conference has ended up in a very moving. I just wanted to really briefly just I suppose recap, you know, some of the threads of the workshop as I've experienced them, as they've come up through the last couple of afternoons, both in the speakers' interventions, but also in the interventions made by those providing comments and questions. And I want to thank not only all the speakers, but also the other participants and the contribution that they made through their listening and through their questions. We've talked a lot, obviously, about community and forms of community that are normative, forms of communication that are normative and maybe that try to channel us into certain normative ways of being. We've talked about solitude. We've talked, something that's come up quite a lot is this sort of question of the individuation, the individual's relation to the other, and the spaces that are made between us. Can we ever hear somebody? Do we only ever hear ourselves? I was struck by something Tim said in the panel just now about, you know, do you ever hear another voice? And that question of attunement to others and their experience and their needs was something that was came up very powerfully also in Corinna's paper yesterday. We talked about connectedness and the spaces between us as a positive and enabling force. I mean, Kate's idea coming from Winnicott regarding the idea of the holding space, I think is an immensely rich and powerful idea and a very positive one. But then, of course, we also looked at the idea of connectedness in its more negative and sinister facets as well. That gets us back to, I think, Bernard's paper, questions of surveillance, questions of always having to be on through being connected and such like. We talked about actual spaces, physical spaces. I'm thinking of Zinna's paper yesterday and Hannah's paper with their evocation of certain natural spaces and what that does, what being in a certain space can do to forms of community, what being in a certain space can do to the individual, in the case of Rousseau, as discussed by Zinna. We also talked about kind of very regulated spaces, such as the space of the bar or the nightclub, regulated by certain forms of behavior and experience in Patrick's paper, the space obviously of the domestic home, the adjoining bedrooms, the wall between them, in Tom's paper. And I liked all those discussions of physical spaces and what they do to people's relationships with each other and their perceptions of other people. I think the thing that for me was the most powerful was the idea of how things are narrated and how things are represented. I mean, so many of the papers were concerned with literature and art and translation and ongoing creative work that is very much attuned to this question of how it's possible to make the voice of another heard. For me, one of the lines that I think summarizes the great value of the discussions we've been having is a line from Corinna's paper yesterday, which was, in order to change the future, you have to change the way you narrate what has happened so far. And I found that really beautiful. So I'll stop there because I'm just rambling. These are some of the things that I found interesting. I wanted to open up the discussion, ask you the points that you as speakers, as listeners would like to bring out that you think are particularly worthy of interest. And a question, I suppose, for the speakers specifically, those of you who do have ongoing projects that your presentations arose from, I'm interested in knowing, whether and how the discussions that we've been having yesterday and today, whether those are going to play into the ongoing unfurling of those projects. It'd be interesting to know. So I'd like to open the discussion. Corinna.
Yeah, thank you for the comments. That's always very hard to do. So I appreciate the concise but also the rich summary that you've just offered us. I'm not actually addressing your question, but I wanted to draw your attention to the beautiful program and especially the image in the program, the Siberian bear hunting armor, 19th century. And I wanted to ask about that. When I first looked, I had never seen anything like that before, and it reminded me of the parable of the porcupines, that Schopenhauer mentions, and then Freud did Civilization and its Discontents, and also Barthes. So what's up with this Siberian bear hunting armor? I looked it up, and apparently it's an open question whether they were really used, but maybe you have some kind of narrative attached to it, and I'm really curious what went into this choice. Thank you.
Thanks, Corinna. Thanks very much. Yes, that's an absolutely amazing image, and it is very similar to a porcupine. And Katja, Tom, Marie, and I have a WhatsApp group that we've been using to discuss practical questions. And Katja at one point shared with us a very beautiful picture of a porcupine that I believe she met in Berlin this summer. And Katja was saying that the porcupine should be the sort of mascot of the workshop. But to comment on the Siberian bear hunting image, I'll pass over to Marie, because it was Marie who found that image.
I have to admit that this image is, well, I found it on Reddit. Actually, my partner found it on Reddit first, and then he said, "That is your project." I said, "Thanks, you understand my project," because it actually also made me think of obviously of the hedgehog, of Schopenhauer's hedgehogs, actual historical, yeah, like venture into bear hunting, but rather I thought it kind of yeah, exemplified so beautifully this idea of human porcupines and how you have to keep at a distance and as a kind of protection, like the Plasnerian, I guess, also idea of the armor as protection in the public space.
Thanks, Marie. I'm seeing some other hands raised. I think Tim Matthews was first. Tim. You need to unmute, Tim.
So yeah, thanks, Lucy, for giving us so much to think about in your summarizing that way. I don't know, I just thought I'd pick up on the first, broadly things to do with action and what we could do on the basis of this type of conversation to change future conversations about the world we're suffering under or living under or something. This is really just to say, like, it doesn't seem to have an answer to that question, I must say. I'm still as much in the dark, although in an illuminated darkness, if you like, at the end of these 2 days that I was at the beginning. I mean, it seems to me that a lot of what we're talking about, rightly or wrongly, I mean, just say it in a neutral way, a lot of what we're talking about has to do with praxis, doesn't it? With practice, with how we do things, and why that matters, and the ethical content of different kinds of relations, or the ethical content of different forms of communication or forms of writing, or the development of forms of writing, and the relational content of formal practices. These are things that for one, I'm completely committed to. I mean, I've been driven by these things. But right now, as I say, Barthes, just because we're talking about today. Barthes' sort of formal evolution through his work is one way of saying that none of them has really achieved what its imaginary ambition would have been, which is to translate itself from practical work to material work. He talks somewhere about in the fragment somewhere the absolute materialism of, I think it's of I Love You actually, the complete materialism. That's what we're after, is we're really bang on contact with the material world, and this is and the mere fact that he's putting that as a key pillar in an imaginary stage, pretty much says it all. Why? And I don't. This is not, as you understand, this is not a criticism. This is really an observation of the situation. I don't know. I feel I find myself in.
Yeah. Thank you, Tim. Tobias, I think you were next.
Thank you. Well, this was actually intended as a question to Tim from the other panel, but I guess I can turn it into a comment. When you talked about the friendship with Roland Barthes as a translator, it made me think of the significance that the motive of the dead friend has in all the discourse of friendship. And this obviously goes all the way back to Montaigne's essay on friendship. And Barthes talks about it in the preface of Saint Fourier d'Oyola, the dead friend, who's writing the biography. And I guess my question would have been, what kind of friendship is it with a living author that one translates?
It's, I guess, not just for me to reply, but I can only say I don't have an experience of translating a living author. So, oh yes, I do. Sorry, what am I talking about? I do have an, yeah. But of course, yeah. I think every experience is different, honestly. I mean, on this particular occasion, the living author I'm talking about was completely absent. He isn't dead, and I'm glad to say that, obviously. But in terms of the translation project, he just wasn't there, which was quite good, really. I think, but to be serious, sorry, to respond to your question seriously, I think it has to do with some degree of distance. In the conversation about with Kate earlier, that Katja initiated, about merging one into the other. I think whether they're living or they're dead, translating reminds you of the differences involved, the distances involved. I think that's the point I would make.
Thanks again, Tim. Thank you, Tobias. Patrick was next, I think.
Thanks. Yes, I just wanted to go back to the spiky men image. And related, I don't know, it seems to me there's a lot of consistency around the motif that David, I didn't speak about, but from David, the motif of handling that was relevant to David's paper yesterday. And there's lots of resonance in that for me about handling. How does one handle others? How does one handle grief, the death of others? Both in the sense of coping with it, handling also in the sense of, in the more Winnicottian sense of holding and caring. And yeah, I don't know, handling in the sense of the space between, as the kind of gestural dynamics in the space between one body and another, or one group of bodies and another group of bodies. So yes, that was, and I suppose it relates to care as well, which I seem to be, which isn't a word that we've evoked much, but there seems to be kind of consistency across all the papers there. So this is a kind of response to your initial question, Lucy.
Thank you, Patrick. Yes, yeah, I think, well, that question of care came out, I think, most explicitly at the end in Kate's paper, but has been very much present in some of the other communications as well. I'm thinking of Tom's paper yesterday, for example, in particular. Bernard, I think you were next.
So I just wanted to signal an appreciation for a particular thread, which is, I think it was at the beginning of yesterday, someone mentioned the Sherry Turkle book, Alone Together, which in some ways, I think there's something a little problematically nostalgic about it, in the sense that it presents a kind of vision partially of technology depriving us of some type of form of intimacy. And Alone Together has a distinctly, I think, negative valence in there. And I think one of the things I appreciate is that for so many of the papers, actually, Alone Together had a potentially positive valence, in the sense that various forms of loss, various forms of distance, including those that are somehow forced upon us, have potential, have certain promises of, let's not say liberation, but discovery. I mean, one of the things that jumped out at me was, so Marie, for example, talked about grief as an ethic of potentiality, which to me, I found very, very inspiring. And there were, I could go through some of the other, papers, whether it was the Utopia of Social Distance or Idiorhythmy, but in many of these papers, there was a way of talking about distance and gaps that was not nostalgic, was not longing for a kind of recovery, but also a sense of how, the fullness of those gaps. And I just, for me, that was in these times where we are so technically mediated, and also it's COVID-19 we're dealing with, whether it's COVID-19 or whether it's also something even like climate change, we're dealing with so many types of loss in the present. It's kind of overwhelming. And so against that backdrop, I just want to express a real appreciation for the richness with the way people talked about loss and distance throughout the conference. And to me, at this moment, that's incredibly valuable.
Thank you so much, Bernard. I think you said that much better than I could have. I completely agree with every word of that. I think that's I'm glad that you found the events useful in that way. Okay, moving on to Chris.
Yes, it was not so much a comment or a question, but a kind of paradox that came across, especially in the last session, but also in relation to what Bernard was saying about kind of resistance towards a technocratic regime. But the interesting and paradoxical thing was that a lot of the effects that are kind of used to sabotage this system are negative, unproductive effects in a certain way, like mourning, grieving, kind of obsessional love of je t'aime, which is of course also very unproductive, and also parenthood as a moment where you're no longer productive for the world, and just encapsulated in this kind of very beautifully formulated kind of other timely zone that you enter, and that has no plot to it. And I was really wondering how this kind of massive effects which allow for little movement can be a form of freedom, can be a form of resistance, while the problem is at the moment you're completely blocked, and there's a kind of need for being activist and a need to produce, a need to write, but at the same time these very effects that make change possible, kind of idea of the vita nova, or the kind of St. Paul being struck by lightning, makes you blind, makes you incapable. I think what Kate was saying about parenthood is a very good example. You're confronted with another form of life, not only actual new life, but also how it changes your own life. But at the same time, it's the least ideal time to be activist, because you simply don't have the energy to change things, because life is so shattered. So I was wondering how other people in the different ways see these paradoxes.
Yes, what an interesting question, and I think yeah, that tension between well, maybe it was something I was trying to grasp at in my introduction to this final session. And Tim has been talking about it too, the desire for action, but the small spaces that exist for action, and how we sort of grapple with that. I see that Kate Briggs has a hand raised, so I'm afraid I'm going to let her to queue jump, because I think that Chris's comment just now was perhaps particularly relevant to some topics that Kate was discussing. So Kate, over to you.
Thank you. Sorry, I was just in to thank Chris for what he just said, and also for Bernard as well. But I just, in response to what you were saying about, which is something that speaks to me very clearly, is that sense of it being sort of the encounter, the living with, the being, the kind of untimely, unpredictable being of the baby, being also that time of life, that duration of life where one can't act. But then I guess I would maybe want to affirm the kind of sorts of the spaces of action. You know, where are the spaces of action and activity, and the notion that they are outside, non-domestic, in spaces like the seminar, the university, the street, and to kind of claim the space of the home as being a space of action, activity, activism, at the very, very local. And maybe that is something I think that maybe this sort of form of communication is doing. I'm sort of deeply committed to the book. Maybe that was clear the way I was kind of lifting books as a kind of material object. What I love about Ursula Le Guin's kind of carrier bag theory of fiction, which I kind of quoted in the materials that circulated beforehand, is she thinks of the kind of technology of the book as a way of bringing the energy home. And which reminds me of what Barthes says in a very early review that I think he wrote, I don't know when he wrote it, very young, that something like, a society is civilized to the degree to which it brings its art objects, its cultural objects into the home. They circulate in the home and in bringing them into relation with ordinary lives. And books do this, I think, in very important ways. But something like this, to sort of spin it positively, but something like this is also a way of bringing, your energies as a kind of collective, a kind of configuration of heads and brains, into my home for the last 2 afternoons. So, I would just say, to think of the home too as a space of action and activity, and these sort of channels, maybe the tubes that we create, or these common spaces that we're able to create through writing books, a common thing, through weird spaces like this, have that potentiality to bring energies into the home, which feels important. So thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, certainly this whole period where everybody has been living differently to how they've ever lived before is a period in which hopefully those of us who are fortunate enough to have this experience have found that different forms of action and of production are taking place in our lives, and they're taking place in our homes, because we haven't been anywhere else. So I think what you're saying is maybe something that's been very profoundly felt by a lot of people if they're fortunate enough to be in that situation. Thank you. Katja had a question, or comment rather.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I think there's not very much I want to say, because I wanted to pick up on Karina's question about the Siberian armor, and I will be very brief, because when Marie came up with this image, I thought, oh, this is quite hostile, and actually, contradicts the idea of a potentially positive notion of distance, as distance, communally to be explored, as a distance as a form of care, as we seem to have established one aspect of it, perhaps particularly in this concluding discussion. So I'm glad, really relieved, actually, that the the overtone of the entire discussion is, as Bernard so beautifully summarized it, is not the idea that we are all solitary creatures, floating through space in splendid isolation, but that on the contrary, there's a positive value to distance, or with Plessner, who came up, and Karina's contributions to our conversation. And I think Marie mentioned that as well, that the notion of distance is at the heart of any well-working society. So yes, I think I'm quite relieved that this seems to be the undercurrent theme of this workshop. I'm basically repeating what Bernard said much better, so I'm gonna stop here. Thank you, Lucy.
Thanks, Katja. Hannah.
Thank you. Yeah, I was like raising and unraising my hand, and I think that gets to what I'm trying to think through right now. Is it was lovely to be part of this, and I was so honored to be invited, and I would have loved to have been in person with all of you, and I'm also glad not to have burned the jet fuel and all of that. But I'm also thinking about the limitations that I'm feeling with Zoom, what it means as an academic when you've had these years of rehearsing a certain kind of performance, which is maybe something more theatrical, the way that a conference usually goes, where you're used to sort of being on stage, off stage, sort of slipping into the shadows. You have all these back channels of communication, you get coffee with people. And the way that for me is, I mean, I think we all feel this, that you just feel like every statement is a declaration. Like you can't, it's difficult to have any nuance in this form, and it may be that the technologies will change and we'll adapt to them. For me, I loved it when Patrick smoked a cigarette because it felt like something else, some other form of, something different, something that I'm not used to seeing in conferences. But it just feels, anyway, it feels like we're all doing a close-up all the time, right? Close-up all the time. And I at least feel like I haven't been prepared for that. Like I haven't been prepared for my close-up. I'm not sure how to do it. So there's something deeply vulnerable about it. And there's just final, like obvious statement about the internet, which is that it feels like it's just built for this constant optimization of self and constant sort of aggrandization of yourself, and any kind of signaling of commiseration or sympathy seems like virtue signaling. And it's just, I'm struggling. I'm struggling with the form a little bit, but I also really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for verbalizing. Yeah, I think thoughts that certainly I've been having. I'd say we've probably all been having them. It takes a very particular kind of energy to do this, and it's a very different kind of energy than the energy that you use and that you take from being in people's company. We're in each other's company, but we're not. Your bodies aren't here, and that's deeply sad, actually, because I think this conversation would be different if our bodies were present in the same space as each other. That's the big unspoken backdrop of this whole event, isn't it? I mean, obviously of any event of this kind that's happening at the moment, but all the more so, I think, given the topic of this workshop. I wish we could have seen each other, but conversely, I'm so glad that we did get to see each other and have these conversations all the same. What was the paper yesterday? I know, but all the same. Somebody remind me what paper that was from. I'm having a brain freeze. I can't remember. Anyway, I know, but all the same, the value of the fiction that we are together, I think, is something we can hold to. Tom Baldwin.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. I think that my point is connected very much to what Hannah just said. And yeah, there's not that I've been wanting to hide, but there isn't anywhere to hide really, apart from making your screen black. And I suppose that this platform, Zoom and others like it, creates there are new forms, I guess, of politeness and maybe even tact that we're going to have to get used to. And listening to Tobias and to Bernard and to actually lots of other papers, I was thinking of something that that Derrida says in relation to Heidegger. That sounds very grand. It's not really, but he in a book on photography, and he talks about Heidegger and Heidegger's typewriter and sending photographs, so sending letters and then sending photographs with signatures on them, and about the sort of manners and politeness of sending your photograph with a signature on it. And he says that Heidegger writes, in the time of the first dominance of the typewriter, a letter written on this machine still stood for a breach of good manners. Today, a handwritten letter is an antiquated and undesired thing. It disturbs speed reading. And then he notes a history of politeness. Every history of politeness is a history of technology. And I wonder if, I guess this would have been my question for Katja, but I didn't get to ask it. But just to go to Katja, Katja wanted to make a distinction, or lots of other people have made distinctions between politeness and tact. And I just wonder if every history of tact is also a history of technology. Anyway. That's my question.
Thanks, Tom. Katja, did you want to come in? Did you want to come in to respond to that?
Yes, if I may, very, very briefly, I think this is a wonderful comment. I've been thinking about that ever since Hannah expressed her particular fascination with the pneumatic tube in Truffaut's film. And thank you for bringing in Derrida. I think I'm happy to complement that quotation with one from Theodor Fontane in his novel Der Stechlin, where the protagonist, who is a sort of an old-fashioned man, complains to somebody else about the invention of the and use actually of the telegram, and he says, you know, brevity should be a virtue, but being brief and quick, you know, as at the same time, and delivering your message using the telegram, also means, in most cases, I'm trying to translate from the German here, to be rude or rough or uncivil. Yeah, and so I think that probably speaks to the other undercurrent we've been having throughout the conversation, the implications of time, you know, of speed, and the effect thereof, you know, on how we relate to each other, and politeness and civility and rudeness, being too close and being too far, and drifting away from one another, and the very idea that, you know, that acts of tactfulness require a certain amount of time. If you respond too fast, you know, that there is no space for each of the participants in that you know, situation of that encounter to explore. And so yes, thank you for making that comment. I think it's incredibly important, and, you know, as I said, it emphasizes yet again that we're not just talking about proximity and distance and spatial times, but also about the effects of time, the compression or expansion thereof. So, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Katja. And on that point regarding time and its compression, we're a couple of minutes over. Corinna has had her hand raised for a while, and Kate Briggs also has a point she wants to make. So I'll take Corinna and then Kate, and then I think unfortunately we're going to need to wrap this conversation up. But Corinna, over to you first of all.
Yeah, thank you. My comment also relates to Bernard's point about the fullness of the gaps in the formulation alone together. Like Tom, when I was listening to Tobias's paper, Kafka immediately came to mind. I'm going to read you just one very short note that he wrote at some point to his friend Max Brod. He said, "I am in such a bad way that I think I can only get over it by not speaking to anyone for a week, or as long as may be necessary. From the fact that you won't try to answer this postcard in any way, I shall see that you're fond of me." So no, it's really bad. I think that's very smart, right? And these days I find myself often wanting to write such notes, you know. I mean, it's paradoxical, right? That we are isolated and then we kind of cultivate our isolation sometimes. But then my thought was also that it's interesting to be isolated while at the same time relying on somebody to whom one can write such a note. Right? It means that one still has a friend who is there, and one can take it for granted that there is a presence there caring for us. And this was a thought that I had while we were taking breaks. during the conference, because, you know, when I go to a conference, usually I like the breaks as much, at least as much, or even more sometimes than the actual event, right? The conversations over coffee, over dinner, like Hannah also pointed out. And I was really missing these terribly. In fact, you know, I was, you know, sort of disconnecting my camera and then thinking, well, but now would be the interesting moment, right? The isolation felt even more, you know, palpable. That's just to say that I really appreciate this event, and I want to thank you for organizing it. And I really do hope that there will be some opportunity for us to see one another in person in the not so distant future.
Thanks, Karina. Yes, that would be great. Finally, Kate.
Yeah, just in relation to the comments that were made recently over the last few minutes, I was just reminded again of what Barthes says in the course on the novel, that this lecture course, which is grounded in a fantasy, that it might be possible to speak of my haiku, you know, not anyone else's, but my haiku, and it being about changing the rhetorical conditions of the intellectual. And that seems to me to be kind of maybe part of what one could think about what this kind of event has done, especially, like, you know, the very material kind of concrete level of the 8-minute limit, which I, you know, felt I was exceeding, but, you know, the rhetorical conditions of the intellectual, and there being those frustrations where I absolutely, you know, agree that it's the moments between of the kind of more informal contact which can be so productive, but at the same time to affirm something like access. You know, it's been possible to attend while also actually having 2 children home from school, you know, without you knowing, in the darkness of the, you know, access, not only, you know, access for free, let's say, others could join for free in different parts of the world. You know, what are the conditions, what are the rhetorical conditions of the intellectual that we want to produce and reproduce? And is this moment a moment for actually taking that, you know, being students of that lesson, and thinking about that seriously and materially, and it feels like it's a moment of potentially kind of radical rethinking, I think. Yes, that was my last thought. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It seems, I mean, I'm sure everybody else has been experiencing this, that, you know, since lockdown started, actually our exposure to, or our ability to be in contact with, through the medium of a screen, ideas and artworks and performances that we would never otherwise have experienced, has really, you know, it's been huge. So perhaps this, you know, perhaps this whole period really will inaugurate a shift in access to ideas, I suppose. And yeah, as you suggest, Kate, sort of maybe change our perception of ourselves as speakers and as communicators. It's a lot to think about. It's a lot to take on. I don't have anything more profound to say at this point, except that I'm really, really grateful to all of you, to my co-organisers, to all of the speakers, to all of the people who came to listen, to all of you for all of your ideas. I found this really, really rewarding and illuminating and enjoyable. And we're going to be in touch with all of you, and we'll see where these ideas go. Thank you to all of you for your generosity and your openness in sharing your ideas and in sticking to those time limits. It was hard, but thank you all for making this event run so smoothly, and it's been a really, really great pleasure. I don't know if any of my co-organisers want to say anything before we sign off. They're remaining muted. So I think in the interests of keeping things somewhat to time, we're about 10 minutes over, I will say goodbye on behalf of Tom, Katja and Marie, and thank you so much, and we'll be in touch. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Bye. And thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Chris. Bye, everyone.